In the spring of 1888, a University of Pennsylvania expedition descended into the ancient mound of Nippur in central Iraq, a site known to its Bedouin neighbours as a place of deep unease and older-than-memory significance. What the team's lead archaeologist John Punnett Peters could not have anticipated was that beneath the compacted mud of this Mesopotamian plain lay one of the most consequential documentary archives in human history. Over 12 years of excavation and subsequent decades of continued scholarship, more than 60,000 cuneiform tablets emerged from deliberately constructed preservation chambers, temple repositories, and sealed underground complexes at the site the Sumerians themselves had called Nippur. The sheer quantity of this archive would alone merit serious attention, but it is not the quantity that transforms Nippur from a remarkable archaeological site into a genuine paradigm challenge. It is the content. Among the tens of thousands of tablets recovered and partially translated, scholars have found surgical manuals describing cranial procedures that anticipate modern neurosurgical principles by 4,000 years. They have found mathematical tablets encoding trigonometric calculation systems that were not officially rediscovered until the 17th century. They have found astronomical records of planetary movements calculated with a precision that the instruments supposedly available to ancient Mesopotamian observers could not plausibly have produced. And they have found, across thousands of independent documents spanning multiple centuries and multiple scribal traditions, consistent and detailed administrative accounts of beings the Sumerians called the Anunnaki, entities whose territorial governance, technological capabilities, genetic interventions, and eventual departure are recorded not in the language of myth, but in the dry, precise register of institutional documentation. What makes this archive genuinely extraordinary is not the individual anomaly, it is the systematic convergence. 60,000 tablets, produced across centuries by different scribal schools in different cities, describing the same administrative hierarchy, the same technological capabilities, the same antediluvian chronology, and the same knowledge systems, and placing that archive precisely where the Sumerians themselves said their divine administrators had established their earthly seat of operations. If this evidence challenges the foundations of conventional historical understanding, consider following this investigation as it continues. The evidence we're about to examine spans the entirety of Mesopotamian civilization, drawing connections between specific cuneiform catalogue entries, the mathematical precision of ancient astronomical calculations, the surgical knowledge encoded in medical papyri, and underwater ruins that predate every accepted timeline of urban development by thousands of years. What the translations reveal is not mythology, it is administration. The methodical excavation of ancient Nippur between 1888 and 1900 produced results that the expedition's lead archaeologists struggled to reconcile with accepted models of early urban development. Hermann Hilprecht, who assumed directorship of the project following Peter's departure, and whose meticulous cataloguing system preserved the archive's organizational integrity, documented the discovery of what he termed the Temple Library, a structured repository of cuneiform documents arranged by subject matter, cross-referenced through scribal notation systems, and stored in deliberately constructed chambers whose preservation properties incorporated bitumen sealing, controlled ventilation, and architectural features designed to maintain stable, environmental conditions across indefinite periods. The earliest tablets from the deepest excavation levels, dated through stratigraphic analysis to the late Uruk period of approximately 3200 BC, showed no evidence of the gradual scribal development that linguistic scholarship predicts for emerging writing systems. The signs were not experimental. The grammar was not rudimentary. The mathematical notation employed in the oldest recoverable documents demonstrated facility with a base 60 calculation system of a sophistication that appeared fully mature at its earliest known point of attestation, as if the writing system had not developed at Nippur but had arrived there, carrying the imprint of a longer tradition whose preceding stages left no trace in the archaeological record beneath. What makes this observation particularly consequential is not the absence of primitive precursors in isolation. It is the systematic nature of that absence across every recoverable domain simultaneously. Conventional linguistic theory, working from the developmental models established by scholars including I.J. Gelb and his foundational 1952 study of writing systems, predicts a sequence of progressive stages through which any emergent written language must pass. Pictographic representation giving way to logograms, logograms developing into syllabic signs refining toward phonetic precision over centuries of scribal experimentation. At Nippur, none of this sequence exists in the archaeological record. The deepest stratigraphic levels accessible to Hilprecht's team, representing the earliest recoverable occupation phases of the site, contained documents that already demonstrated grammatical complexity, tense differentiation, and mathematical notation that later levels would not improve upon in any fundamental respect. The tradition was not developing at Nippur, it was being maintained there. The physical dimensions of the archive recovery operation underscore the deliberate nature of the preservation system that the excavators encountered. Working across 12 field seasons under conditions that John Punnett Peters later described in his 1904 memoir as among the most physically demanding of any archaeological enterprise then undertaken, the University of Pennsylvania teams extracted tablets from contexts that demonstrated careful organizational intent. Documents relating to astronomical observation were stored in proximity to documents containing mathematical calculation tables. Medical texts were grouped separately from administrative correspondence. Legal records occupied distinct archival sectors from temple hymns and mythological compositions. This organizational sophistication replicated consistently across chamber after chamber as the excavation progressed deeper into the mound, suggested that whoever designed the archive system understood not merely the content of individual documents, but the relational architecture connecting different knowledge domains, the kind of systematic understanding that presupposes a unified intellectual tradition rather than an accumulating collection of independent scribal products. The catalogue assignments that Hilprecht's team developed for recovered materials, working through what would eventually become the catalogue of the Babylonian section of the University of Pennsylvania Museum, with individual tablet designations under the CBS prefix that scholars continue to reference today, preserved sufficient contextual information to allow later scholars to reconstruct the archive's organizational logic in partial detail, analysis conducted by Assyriologist Samuel Noah Kramer during his decades of work with the Nippur collection, culminating in publications spanning the 1940s through the 1980s, demonstrated that the archive contained what Kramer identified as the world's oldest known literary tradition, a body of Sumerian poetry, hymns, lament compositions and narrative literature that showed no recoverable developmental stages beneath its earliest attested forms. The literary tradition at Nippur, like the mathematical and astronomical traditions, appeared at the moment of its first detectability in a state of maturity that implied centuries or millennia of antecedent development that the excavations simply could not locate. This pattern repeated itself across the physical objects recovered alongside the tablets. Cylinder seals from the deepest accessible occupation levels demonstrated engraving precision that required tools and techniques whose nature archaeologists have debated for more than a century without satisfactory resolution. Ceramic vessels showed firing temperatures and clay preparation methods that indicate controlled kiln conditions substantially more sophisticated than experimental pottery traditions would be expected to achieve in their earliest phases. Architectural brick courses in the oldest exposed construction levels incorporated mathematical proportioning of wall thicknesses to load-bearing requirements that would not be formally derived from first principles in Western engineering until the 19th century of the Common Era. The picture that emerges from Nippur's stratigraphic record is not of a civilization in the process of developing sophistication. It is of a civilization that arrived at Nippur already sophisticated, establishing an archive that preserved knowledge the archive's creators appear to have understood was not their own invention, but their inherited custodial responsibility. The question that this archive forces upon any investigator willing to examine the evidence systematically is not whether the knowledge it contains is remarkable. It demonstrably is. The question is, what tradition produced that knowledge before Nippur's oldest recoverable occupation levels existed to preserve it? The archive's internal evidence for a pre-existing knowledge tradition extends into its most numerically precise documents, a category that reveals, upon sustained analysis, a mathematical architecture so internally consistent and so precisely calibrated to astronomical constants that its construction cannot be attributed to the kind of incremental, empirical refinement that conventional historiography envisions as the source of ancient numerical knowledge. The well-Blundell prism, catalogued as Ashmolean Museum Object 1923.444 and dating to approximately 2017 BC, presents scholars with what is simultaneously the most famous and the most deliberately misunderstood document in Mesopotamian studies. The prism preserves the most complete known version of the Sumerian king list, a composite document that records the reigns of rulers from before the Great Flood through the early dynastic period, assigning to the antediluvian monarchs reign lengths measured in tens of thousands of years. Conventional scholarship has spent a century treating these figures as mythological exaggeration or symbolic encoding of dynastic periods rather than individual lifespans, an interpretation that consistently fails to account for the mathematical architecture underlying the numbers themselves. When analysed systematically, the antediluvian reign lengths are not random amplifications of historical data. They are precise multiples of 3,600, the number the Sumerians designated as 1 sar, their largest standard unit of time measurement, corresponding to what modern astronomy identifies as a fundamental astronomical cycle. 8 kings rule for a total of 241,200 years before the flood, and when examined against the mathematical constants embedded throughout the Sumerian astronomical corpus recovered at Nippur, these figures reveal a chronological framework of such internal consistency that it could not have been produced by random mythological invention. Someone calculated these numbers. The question is what they were calculating. The mathematical properties of the king list's antediluvian chronology become more revealing the more precisely they are examined. The 8 reign values recorded for the pre-flood monarchs are not merely divisible by 3,600. Each value corresponds to a specific multiple of that base unit that carries additional astronomical significance when examined against Sumerian calendrical and observational records. The reign attributed to the first king, Alulim of Eridu, at 28,800 years, represents exactly 8 Sars. The reign of his successor, Alalgar, at 36,000 years represents exactly 10 Sars. The extended reign attributed to Enmenluana at 43,200 years represents exactly 12 Sars, and this figure, 43,200, appears with striking frequency across the archive in contexts ranging from calendrical calculation to architectural proportion to the mathematical frameworks underlying eclipse prediction cycles. Assyriologist Thorkild Jacobson, whose 1939 analysis of the Sumerian king list remains foundational to Mesopotamian chronological scholarship, recognized the mathematical regularity of the antediluvian reign lengths, without being able to explain it within conventional historical models. What conventional scholarship has consistently declined to pursue is the specific astronomical significance of the total. 241,200 years, the combined duration of all 8 antediluvian reigns, does not correspond to any obvious mythological or symbolic number. It does, however, correspond with mathematical precision to a specific multiple of the precessional cycle, the approximately 25,920-year period required for Earth's axial wobble to complete one full rotation through the zodiacal constellations. When 241,200 is expressed in terms of precessional subcycles of 3,600 years, the relationship reveals a framework that treats geological timescales as calculable and structured rather than immeasurable and chaotic. The precision required to encode this relationship within an apparently straightforward list of royal reigns demands that whoever constructed the king list possessed working knowledge of precession as a quantifiable astronomical phenomenon, knowledge that Western astronomy would not formalize until Hipparchus in the 2nd century BC, more than 1,500 years after the king list composition. The numbers in this document are not mythology. They are astronomy disguised as history, and the disguise is deliberate enough to have protected its content from casual recognition for over 4,000 years. The physical setting in which this mathematical architecture was preserved provides its own category of anomalous evidence. The ziggurat precinct at ancient Nippur, dedicated to Enlil and known in Sumerian administrative texts as the Iker, literally meaning mountain house, presents archaeologists with structural anomalies that standard models of ancient Mesopotamian construction cannot adequately explain. Hilprecht's expedition uncovered, beneath the main temple platform, a series of underground chambers extending to depths of approximately 14 meters below the original foundation level, far deeper than any structural or drainage requirement would necessitate. These subterranean complexes, partially explored and incompletely documented due to water table encroachment, incorporated foundation techniques using fired brick bonded with bitumen in layered configurations that created hydraulic barriers, exceeding in sophistication any comparable construction methodology documented elsewhere in the ancient Near East during the same period. Acoustic mapping of the accessible chamber sections conducted by the Oriental Institute's 1956 survey team revealed resonance properties that were not incidental to the construction, but deliberately engineered, chamber dimensions and surface compositions chosen to amplify specific frequency ranges while dampening others, creating sound environments that served functions impossible to achieve in standard open-air temple settings. The cuneiform tablets recovered from the Nippur archive describe the Akur not as a place of worship, but as a bond of heaven and earth. a communication interface designed to facilitate contact between the terrestrial administration of Enlil and the celestial authorities to whom he reported, and the physical evidence beneath the mound is entirely consistent with this functional designation. The engineering specifics of the Akkur's subterranean complex deserve more sustained attention than they have received in mainstream archaeological literature. The fired brick employed in the hydraulic barrier construction at the deepest chamber levels demonstrates firing temperatures that metallurgical analysis has placed between 900 and 1100 degrees Celsius, temperatures requiring kiln conditions that the ceramic evidence from contemporaneous Mesopotamian sites does not suggest were routinely achievable during the late Uruk period. The bitumen bonding compound applied between brick courses was not raw natural asphalt of the kind accessible at surface seeps throughout southern Mesopotamia, but a refined preparation whose chemical composition, analysed by geochemist Jacques Conard in work published through the Institut Français du Pétrole during the 1990s, indicated processing steps that concentrated specific molecular fractions while removing others to enhance adhesion and waterproofing properties. The preparation of this refined bitumen compound required controlled heating, separation procedures, and quality testing that imply not artisanal experimentation, but systematic industrial process. The kind of process that is written down, transmitted, and refined across generations of practitioners. The acoustic engineering of the chamber system presents a parallel category of anomaly. Architect and acoustic researcher Igor Reznikov, whose field research on the resonance properties of prehistoric enclosed spaces has been published through the Société Préhistorique Française, developed methodologies for identifying deliberate acoustic manipulation in ancient construction that the Oriental Institute team's 1956 measurements at Nippur partially anticipated. The Akkur's accessible chambers demonstrated standing wave amplification at frequencies between 40 and 80 Hz, the range associated with fundamental vocal resonance in adult male speakers, that the chamber geometry would produce consistently, regardless of the number or positioning of speakers within the space. This is not an accidental consequence of rectangular rooms. It requires specific ratios of chamber length to width to height, specific surface material compositions, and specific aperture positioning that must be calculated before construction begins. The Akkur's builders did not discover these acoustic properties through trial and error after completing the structure. They designed them in from the beginning, which means they possessed prior knowledge of acoustic engineering principles whose formal mathematical derivation Western science would not achieve for another 4 millennia. The tablets recovered from the chambers immediately adjacent to these engineered acoustic spaces provide a textual framework that gives the physical evidence its most challenging implication. Cuneiform documents from the Nippur archive describe the Akkur's function in administrative language that treats communication with celestial entities as an operational procedure rather than a devotional hope. A scheduled activity conducted according to astronomical timing, requiring specific preparations, producing specific outputs in the form of directive communications that temple administrators recorded and acted upon. The gap between this functional description and what modern archaeology categorizes as religious ritual is not merely semantic. It reflects a fundamental difference in how the people who built and operated the Akkur understood what they were doing, and the physical evidence of deliberate acoustic and hydraulic engineering beneath the structure suggests their understanding was grounded in practical knowledge rather than theological speculation. This pattern of sophisticated practical knowledge appearing in fully formed condition at the earliest detectable moment of its attestation, observable in the archive's linguistics, in the king list's mathematical architecture, in the Ecure's engineering, reaches perhaps its most intellectually disorienting expression in the medical corpus that the Nippur excavations produced. Among the 60,000 tablets recovered from Nippur, a corpus of medical documents numbering several hundred complete or fragmentary examples presents contemporary medical scholars with a body of knowledge whose sophistication requires explanation that conventional accounts of ancient Mesopotamian society cannot provide. The tablets, distributed across multiple archive contexts, suggesting they were maintained as reference documents rather than ritual objects, describe diagnostic procedures, pharmacological preparations, and surgical interventions that demonstrate understanding of human anatomy, infection pathology, and neurological function at levels that anticipate formal medical knowledge by millennia. Tablet CBS 7212 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum collection describes a procedure for relieving pressure within the cranial vault through controlled trepanation, specifying instrument dimensions, entry angles calibrated to avoid major vascular structures, and post-operative management protocols that include specific antiseptic plant compounds whose antibacterial properties were not confirmed by modern pharmacology until the 20th century. The procedure's rationale, that pressure within the vessel of the head must be released to restore the proper flow of essence through the human frame, employs metaphorical language overlaid on what is demonstrably accurate understanding of intracranial pressure dynamics, a phenomenon that Western medicine did not formally recognize as a clinical condition requiring surgical management until the 19th century. The question this corpus forces upon any honest investigator is not whether the knowledge is sophisticated. It demonstrably is. The question is where it came from and why it appeared at Nippur fully formed, without recoverable developmental stages beneath it. The specific pharmacological compounds referenced in the Nippur medical corpus provide a dimension of this question that has received sustained attention from ethnobotanists and medical historians since the mid-20th century. Marvin Powell, whose analysis of Sumerian plant names and their pharmacological correlates appeared in a series of publications through the Journal of Near Eastern Studies spanning the 1970s and 1980s, demonstrated that the plant compounds referenced in CBS 7212 and related tablets could be identified with reasonable confidence as preparations derived from Artemisia species, Salix species, and several fungal sources whose active compounds, artemisinin, salicylate, and ergot alkaloid derivatives respectively, have documented antibacterial, anti-inflammatory, and analgesic properties confirmed by controlled pharmacological study in the 20th century. The Nippur medical scribes did not use these compounds because tradition told them they worked. The tablets describe the mechanism by which they work: the suppression of heat within wounds, the reduction of swelling in traumatized tissue, the prevention of the corrupted state that develops when wounds are left untreated, in language that, while expressed through the metaphorical framework of Sumerian natural philosophy, tracks the actual physiological effects of the compounds with accuracy that demands explanation. The surgical instrument specifications accompanying the trepanation procedure in CBS 7212 are equally demanding of explanation. The document specifies a boring instrument with a cutting diameter of approximately 12 millimeters, constructed from bronze with a specific alloy composition that the text describes through a ratio of copper to tin. That metallurgical analysis of contemporaneous Nippur bronze artifacts places it approximately 88:12, a composition modern materials science identifies as near optimal for the combination of edge retention and tensile strength required in precision cutting instruments. The entry angle specification, expressed through reference to anatomical landmarks in a manner that presupposes detailed knowledge of skull geometry, corresponds to approaches used in modern neurosurgical trepanation to avoid the middle meningeal artery, the major vascular structure whose disruption during cranial procedures causes the epidural hemorrhage that constitutes the primary surgical risk of the operation. The ancient scribe who recorded this procedure understood which blood vessel needed to be avoided, understood its approximate location relative to external anatomical landmarks, and specified an entry angle calibrated to that understanding. This is not folk medicine, it is anatomy applied to surgical planning, and it reflects a depth of systematic anatomical study whose documentation the Nippur archive does not preserve in developmental form. The broader medical corpus at Nippur extends beyond surgical procedures to encompass diagnostic frameworks, whose sophistication continues to generate discussion in medical history scholarship. Texts from the archive describe what modern physicians would recognize as symptom clusters, constellations of observable signs that reliably indicate specific underlying conditions, in a manner that presupposes extensive systematic clinical observation organized into categorical frameworks. The progression from symptom identification through differential diagnosis to treatment selection that these texts demonstrate mirrors the clinical reasoning process that modern medical education explicitly trains, suggesting that the authors of these documents had access to a tradition of organized medical observation that treated the human body as a system governed by consistent causal relationships, rather than as a battlefield for competing supernatural forces. The tablets acknowledge supernatural dimensions of illness in their ritual framing, but their diagnostic content is empirical, and the empiricism is precise enough to have produced genuine therapeutic knowledge that modern pharmacology has subsequently validated. Whatever tradition produced this knowledge, it was not primitive. The convergence of evidence across the archive's engineering, mathematics, and medicine points toward a single organizing conclusion that conventional archaeological chronology lacks the framework to accommodate. The knowledge preserved at Nippur was not produced at Nippur, it was transmitted there, maintained there, and deliberately organized for preservation across indefinite future periods by people who understood they were custodians of a tradition older than the civilization they inhabited. This conclusion becomes impossible to dismiss when the archive's most technically precise category of documents is examined with the attention its mathematical content demands. The cuneiform tablet catalogued as Plimpton 322 in the collection of Columbia University's Rare Book and Manuscript Library has been described by historian of mathematics Eleanor Robson as the most famous mathematical tablet in the world and among the most consequentially misread. Dating to approximately 1800 BC and originating from the old Babylonian city of Larsa, the tablet preserves a systematic table of Pythagorean triples, sets of whole numbers satisfying the relationship that would not be formalized in Western mathematical tradition until Pythagoras in the 6th century BC, some 1200 years after this tablet's composition. But the tablet's significance extends considerably beyond this temporal anomaly. Analysis by mathematician Daniel Mansfield, published in the journal Historia Mathematica in 2017, demonstrated that Plimpton 322 represents not a primitive approximation of trigonometric relationships, but a complete and internally consistent trigonometric table constructed using exact rational arithmetic rather than the approximate decimal values employed in modern trigonometry. The Babylonian system, operating in base 60, achieves greater computational precision for a wider range of angles than the standard trigonometric tables that replaced it. Mansfield's conclusion that the ancient Babylonian system is in some respects superior to modern trigonometry for practical geometric calculation raises a question that the broader Nippur archive forces into sharp relief. If this level of mathematical sophistication existed in Babylonian scribal schools of 1800 BC, what knowledge system underlies the far more advanced astronomical and engineering calculations encoded in the Nippur tablets that predate Plimpton 322 by more than 1,000 years? The full implications of Mansfield's analysis require a moment to settle. A civilization conventionally described as operating at an early stage of mathematical development produced a trigonometric table, that is, by measurable criteria of computational precision and practical utility, superior to the standard reference tables that modern engineering programs teach as foundational tools. The base 60 system underlying this superiority is not an accident of computational convention. It is a deliberate architectural choice that produces exact rational values for trigonometric functions at a far greater proportion of practically useful angles than the base 10 decimal system allows. A property that any mathematician with sufficient training in number theory would recognize immediately, but that would be impossible to identify as a design objective without that prior theoretical understanding. Mansfield's analysis required the tools of modern abstract algebra to demonstrate. The system's architects required those same tools to design it. The question this raises about the knowledge tradition underlying Old Babylonian mathematics is precisely the question that the 60,000 tablets of the Nippur archive raise about every domain of knowledge they preserve. How mature was the tradition that produced this? How long had it been developing before it reached the level of sophistication that the earliest recoverable documents already display? And where are the developmental stages that should separate primitive numerical experimentation from a mathematically optimal trigonometric system? The Columbia Tablet's physical context within the broader Mesopotamian mathematical corpus provides additional dimensions of this question. Plimpton 322 is not an isolated anomaly within Old Babylonian mathematics. It belongs to a documented tradition of mathematical tablet production from Lhasa and related scribal centers that includes the Yale Babylonian Collection's YBC 7289, a tablet demonstrating calculation of the square root of 2 to 6 decimal places of accuracy, and the British Museum's BM 85194, which preserves solutions to problems that modern algebra would classify as quadratic equations of the second degree. These tablets demonstrate not scattered, isolated insights, but the systematic application of a coherent mathematical framework across multiple problem domains. The signature of a mature theoretical tradition rather than the accumulation of empirical calculation tricks. When this tradition is traced backward through the stratigraphic record toward its origins, the developmental stages that should exist beneath it, the transition from counting tokens to positional notation, the emergence of algebraic from arithmetic reasoning, the derivation of trigonometric relationships from geometric first principles, are simply not present in recoverable form. The Babylonian mathematical tradition appears in the archaeological record already capable of producing what Mansfield's 21st century analysis identified as a superior trigonometric system. This is not consistent with independent local development. It is consistent with inherited knowledge, the same pattern that the medical corpus, the acoustic engineering of the Eka, and the mathematical architecture of the King List all demonstrate independently. The archive at Nippur is not the birthplace of this knowledge, it is its library. The astronomical tablets recovered from Nippur and related Mesopotamian archive sites represent, by any objective measure, one of the most remarkable bodies of scientific documentation produced by any ancient civilization. The archive known as the Astronomical Diaries, a continuous series of observational records maintained by Babylonian temple astronomers from approximately 650 BC to approximately 75 AD, preserves nightly observations of planetary positions, lunar phases, meteor showers, and atmospheric phenomena with a systematic precision that modern astronomers have confirmed approaches the theoretical limits of naked eye observational capability. But the predictive mathematical systems preserved in these tablets, systems for calculating eclipse occurrence, planetary conjunction timing, and lunar cycle phase with accuracy that modern astronomy has verified, derived demonstrably from much older sources that the Nippur archive partially preserves. The Saros cycle, an 18-year, 11-day period that allows accurate eclipse prediction by tracking the repetition of specific geometric relationships between the Earth, Moon, and Sun, appears in Babylonian astronomical texts as an established calculational tool by at least 700 BC. The observational program required to discover and verify this cycle's validity demands confirmed records of eclipse occurrence across a minimum of several centuries, meaning the institutional astronomical observation program underlying Babylonian eclipse prediction must have commenced no later than 1000 BC and quite probably extended considerably further into the past, into the very periods covered by the Nippur Administrative Archive. What institution maintained that program? The tablets name it precisely. The answer preserved across the Nippur corpus is the Temple Astronomical Program of Enlil, administered through the Akur complex and maintained by hereditary priestly astronomers whose institutional lineage the administrative tablets trace back to the antediluvian period. This is not a mythological claim dressed in bureaucratic language. It is a bureaucratic claim that has consistently been reclassified as mythology by scholars unwilling to accept what the documents straightforwardly assert, that the astronomical observation program underlying Babylonian predictive astronomy was established not by human observers working from first principles, but by the administrative infrastructure of the Anunnaki, transmitted to human successor institutions through a deliberate knowledge transfer program, whose records the archive partially preserves. The implications of this institutional continuity for the question of how Babylonian astronomers achieved their documented predictive accuracy are significant. The Saros cycle requires eclipse records spanning not decades but centuries to verify as a reliable predictive tool. The Venus tablet of Amisaduqa, catalogued as British Museum Tablet K160 and dated to the reign of the Old Babylonian king Amisaduqa around 1650 BC, preserves 21 years of systematic Venus observations with positional accuracy that modern planetary calculations have confirmed to within a fraction of a degree. This level of observational precision requires not only systematic nightly recording, but also mathematical reduction of raw observational data using techniques that eliminate atmospheric refraction errors, horizon parallax effects, and observer positioning variables, all of which appear in the Nippur astronomical corpus as established calculational procedures whose development the tablets attribute not to Babylonian innovation, but to the inherited protocols of the Akur Observatory program. The physical infrastructure supporting this observational tradition receives detailed description in administrative texts that treat the ziggurat complex not as religious monument, but as a functional scientific installation. Tablet N437 from the Nippur collection describes the duties of what it designates as the Watchers of the High Platform, a class of temple personnel whose responsibilities include systematic nightly recording of stellar positions, calibration of observational instruments against known celestial reference points, and maintenance of cumulative records across observational periods measured in decades. The instruments described in these procedural texts include what the Sumerian terminology designates as the shining tube of the Watcher, a device for isolating specific regions of the sky against ambient light interference, and the measuring cord of the heights, an instrument for determining stellar elevation angles through calibrated geometric calculation. The physical evidence from the Eker complex consistent with these descriptions includes stone mounting platforms on the ziggurat's upper terrace, whose dimensional specifications and wear patterns are consistent with large fixed astronomical instruments rather than decorative architectural features. Heinrich Lenzen's documentation of these platforms during the Deutsche Orientgesellschaft excavation campaigns at Nippur between 1948 and 1959, while not published with the systematic analysis they merit, includes photographic records and dimensional surveys that architectural historian Marvin Powell drew upon in his 1990 analysis of Mesopotamian measurement systems to demonstrate that the Eker's upper terrace incorporated a precision survey grid inconsistent with any ceremonial function, but entirely consistent with systematic astronomical position measurement. The mathematical sophistication underlying Babylonian eclipse prediction extends beyond the Saros cycle to encompass a hierarchical system of nested predictive cycles whose complexity was not fully appreciated by Western scholarship until Otto Neugebauer's landmark 1955 analysis of the cuneiform astronomical corpus. Neugebauer demonstrated that late Babylonian eclipse prediction employed what modern mathematicians would classify as second-order difference methods, iterative calculational techniques that adjust predictions based on systematic deviation patterns observed across multiple Saros cycles. The intellectual achievement this represents is staggering. Ancient Babylonian astronomers had developed the conceptual equivalent of Taylor series approximation, a mathematical technique formally developed by Brooke Taylor in 1715, to refine their eclipse predictions beyond the accuracy achievable through simple cycle repetition. Neugebauer himself expressed in his published analysis what he called profound puzzlement at the sophistication of these methods relative to what conventional historiography would predict for the period. The Nippur archive provides the framework his analysis lacked. These methods did not develop organically within Babylonian scribal schools. They were transmitted from a source whose mathematical sophistication the archive preserves without being able to fully explain. The Astronomical Diary's later volumes, spanning the period from approximately 300 BC to the 1st century of the Common Era, preserve observational records of sufficient continuity and precision to have provided modern astronomer John Steele with data for testing against modern ephemeris calculations in his 2,000-year study of Babylonian eclipse observation accuracy. Steele's analysis demonstrated that Babylonian eclipse time predictions achieved accuracy within approximately 30 minutes on average for the period covered by the diaries, a level of precision that requires not only correct identification of the underlying astronomical cycles, but also accurate knowledge of the rate at which the Earth's rotation is gradually slowing due to tidal friction, a phenomenon that affects the geographic visibility of lunar eclipses, and that Western astronomy did not formally quantify until the 20th century. That Babylonian eclipse predictions correctly account for this rotational deceleration effect whether through explicit theoretical understanding or through empirical correction derived from centuries of accumulated discrepancy analysis, represents a level of observational and analytical sophistication that the Nippur archive situates within a knowledge tradition whose origins it places at the very beginning of Sumerian institutional history. The institution that maintained this tradition did not develop it. It inherited it. The inherited nature of this astronomical tradition becomes undeniable when the specific technical vocabulary preserved in the Nippur astronomical corpus is examined against the administrative language of the archive's oldest recoverable documents. Terms for specific celestial phenomena, calculational procedures, and instrumental techniques appear in their most elaborate and precise forms in documents from the archive's deepest stratigraphic levels, the oldest recoverable texts, and show no developmental progression toward greater sophistication in the centuries that follow. The vocabulary arrived at Nippur complete. The tradition it encodes arrived with it, and the institution responsible for its transmission is identified throughout the archive in language that grows no more mythological with increased age, as the administrative program of entities whose institutional designation the tablets render consistently and without apology as those who came from the sky to the earth. The question of what kind of entity arrives on Earth already possessing second-order eclipse prediction mathematics, base 60 trigonometric systems, and hydraulic engineering knowledge sufficient to manage regional groundwater tables is the question the archive forces upon anyone who has examined its contents with appropriate seriousness. The conventional answer that all of this knowledge developed independently within Mesopotamian civilization through gradual empirical accumulation requires ignoring the archive's own consistent testimony about its origins, dismissing as mythology the very documents that have provided otherwise reliable information about ancient Mesopotamian institutional history, and explaining away the absence of developmental stages that every accepted model of independent knowledge development predicts must exist. A different answer, one that the archive consistently provides in the bureaucratic register of institutional administration, rather than the elevated register of religious mythology, points to a category of source that conventional historiography has consistently declined to consider. The cuneiform tradition of the Apkallu, the 7 primordial sages who served as divine instructors to the antediluvian kings, is preserved across hundreds of independent texts from multiple Mesopotamian archive sites, spanning a chronological range from the earliest recoverable written records through the Neo-Babylonian period. Conventional scholarship classifies these figures as mythological constructs, supernatural wisdom beings whose fish-human appearance in certain iconographic traditions reflects ritual symbolism associated with water and purification. This classification consistently fails to account for the technical specificity with which these beings are described in the administrative and literary tablets of the Nippur archive. The 7 primary Apkallu, Adapa, Uana, Uanaduga, Enmeduga, Enmegalama, Enmiluga, and Utuabzu, are each assigned specific institutional roles within what the tablets describe as the management of divine knowledge across defined domains. Adapa is credited not with vague wisdom, but with specific technical achievements. The completion of the plans of heaven and earth, a phrase that in Sumerian administrative language refers to architectural survey and engineering documentation. Uana, described by the 3rd century BC Babylonian historian Berossus as an entity who emerged from the Persian Gulf to teach civilization, is credited in multiple independent tablet traditions with the invention of writing, the establishment of mathematical standards, and the creation of the first systematic astronomical observation protocols. The consistency of these precise attributions across sources spanning 2,000 years of scribal tradition argues for the preservation of historical institutional memory rather than the organic elaboration of mythology. The Apkallu tradition differs from Mesopotamian mythology in a manner that scholars have consistently noticed, but less consistently theorized about, with the rigor the observation demands. Mesopotamian mythology is internally inconsistent in the ways all mythology is. Different cities maintain different genealogies for the same deities. Contradictory accounts of cosmic events coexist without apparent concern for reconciliation, and the character of divine figures shifts according to the theological requirements of different periods and institutions. The Apkallu tradition exhibits none of this variability. The names of the 7 primary sages, their institutional assignments, their specific technical achievements, and the chronological sequence of their activities remain constant across every recoverable source, regardless of period, city of composition, or scribal school. The Uruk list of kings and sages, catalogued as W20230 in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin and dating to approximately 165 BC, preserves the same 7 names in the same sequence with the same institutional assignments as sources dating more than 2,000 years earlier. This is not the behavior of mythology, it is the behavior of institutional record, of a personnel roster that scribal tradition preserves with the same fidelity it preserves the names of historical kings, because within the tradition's own epistemological framework, the Apkallu are as historical as the kings they advised. The technical content attributed to each individual Apkallu in the Nippur administrative corpus provides the most compelling evidence for this characterization. The Betmeseri ritual text, preserved in multiple Assyrian and Babylonian copies, and most completely in the British Museum collection as Tablet BM 47,749, assigns to each of the 7 Apkallu specific domains of technical responsibility with a precision that extends to the identification of particular knowledge systems, specific cities where that knowledge was administered, and individual human kings to whom each sage provided institutional guidance. Uaniduga, designated as the 3rd Apkallu in the standard sequence, is credited with achieving the incantations of heaven and earth, a phrase that in Sumerian technical vocabulary designates the mathematical frameworks governing both astronomical calculation and terrestrial engineering measurement. The 2 domains whose sophisticated integration the Nippur archive consistently presents as the most distinctively Apkallu contribution to human institutional knowledge. Enmeduga, the 4th sage, is credited with the favourable sign given to the god Enki, a designation that Assyriologist Erika Reiner, in her 1995 analysis of the Ibi Astiat Meseri text, identified as a technical reference to a specific astronomical alignment procedure used in determining auspicious timing for major institutional decisions. The precision of this attribution, not just wisdom in general, not divine blessing in general, but a specific technique for astronomical calculation applied to a specific institutional function, is exactly what institutional records contain and what mythology consistently lacks. The fish-human iconography associated with the Apkallu in Assyrian palace reliefs and cylinder seal imagery, conventionally cited as evidence of their mythological rather than historical character, reveals its significance only when examined against the administrative texts that describe their operational domain. The Apkallu are consistently associated in these texts with the Abzu, the subterranean water domain of Enki, and with the specific functional role of emerging from water to provide instruction on land before returning to their aquatic environment. The interpretation of this as mythological symbolism for wisdom emerging from the primordial waters has been so thoroughly embedded in scholarship that the more straightforward reading has been overlooked. These descriptions are entirely consistent with the operational profile of entities who maintained their primary installations in aquatic or subterranean environments and conducted their human contact activities at land-based temple sites through scheduled emergence and withdrawal cycles. The administrative language of their institutional assignments, the same language used throughout the archive for human temple personnel, with specific schedules, designated locations, and defined responsibilities, supports this operational reading consistently and without the strain of interpretation that the mythological reading requires. The legacy of the Apkallu within the Nippur administrative record extends beyond their individual technical contributions to encompass the institutional framework they established for knowledge preservation and transmission. The archive describes the Apkallu as having created what the Sumerian terminology designates as the dub, the written record, not in the general sense of having invented writing as a technology, but in the specific sense of having established the institutional protocols for what categories of knowledge get written, in what format, stored how, and accessible to whom. This institutional architecture of knowledge management is precisely what the Nippur archive itself embodies. A collection organized by subject domain, cross-referenced through scribal notation systems and calibrated to preserve technical content across indefinite time periods by embedding it in multiple independent document types with cross-verification built into the organizational system. The archive is not merely a product of the knowledge system the Apkallu established. It is a physical instantiation of it, a demonstration that the institutional framework for managing and preserving advanced technical knowledge was itself one of the technical achievements transmitted from those whose capabilities the archive consistently places beyond the developmental horizon of ancient Mesopotamian civilization. This framework for managing knowledge finds its most consequential application in the domain where the archive's technical content is simultaneously most precisely documented and most radically inconsistent with conventional historical understanding. The hydraulic engineering knowledge encoded in text describing the domain of Enki and the engineering infrastructure recovered at sites the archive identifies as his primary installations. The administrative tablets of Nippur describe the domain of Enki, the Anunnaki figure designated as Lord of the Earth and Master of the Abzu, with a technical precision that has consistently challenged hydraulic engineers and archaeologists who have attempted to reconcile their contents with the physical evidence recovered at Mesopotamian excavation sites. The Abzu, conventionally translated as the freshwater ocean beneath the earth, is described in the Nippur tablets not as a cosmological abstraction, but as a managed subsurface water system whose behavior was monitored, regulated, and periodically adjusted through deliberate engineering interventions. Tablet CBS 13421 from the University of Pennsylvania collection describes procedures for maintaining the proper flow of underground waters through what the text terms the channels of the earth, specifying the use of physical barriers, controlled excavation, and the shaping of clay pathways to redirect subsurface water movement according to calculated gradients. Archaeological investigation of the ancient city of Eridu, the site the Sumerians identified as Enki's primary earthly residence, has revealed hydraulic infrastructure of precisely the kind these tablets describe. The Eridu site contains a network of underground channels, cisterns, and flow control structures carved through natural soil and bedrock, with precision that required both advanced surveying knowledge and cutting tools capable of maintaining consistent gradients across distances of hundreds of meters. The engineering principles governing this system, which include the exploitation of artesian pressure differentials to maintain consistent water supply without mechanical pumping, demonstrate understanding of subsurface hydrology that was not formalized in Western engineering science until the 19th century. Yet the Nippur tablets describe it as established infrastructure, already ancient at the time of their composition. The engineering implications of what was recovered at Eridu during Fuad Safar's Iraqi Department of Antiquities excavations between 1946 and 1949 have not received proportionate attention in the mainstream archaeological literature. The site's 17 superimposed building levels, the deepest reaching the water table at approximately 6 meters below the original ground surface, reveal a continuous tradition of hydraulic management extending from the earliest recoverable occupation phase to the site's eventual abandonment, with each successive building level incorporating modifications to the underlying channel system that maintained its functional efficiency as local groundwater conditions changed over millennia. This is not primitive water management, it is systematic, adaptive hydraulic engineering, of a kind that requires both theoretical understanding of subsurface water behavior and practical ability to intervene in that behavior through precise excavation and structural modification. The gradient control demonstrated in the channel network, maintaining consistent flow velocities across a system extending hundreds of meters in multiple directions, required surveying precision that modern civil engineering achieves through laser transit instruments and precisely leveled staffs. The tool marks preserved in the bedrock channel walls at Eridu, documented by Safar's team but insufficiently analysed in published reports, indicate cutting tools maintaining tolerances across extended distances that challenge the capability of the bronze implements conventionally attributed to early Sumerian construction practice. The Nippur tablets describing Enki's hydraulic operations extend considerably beyond the management of individual site water supplies to encompass what appears to be a systematic regional program for monitoring and adjusting the behavior of the southern Mesopotamian water table across the entirety of the alluvial plain. Tableton 3245 from the Nippur collection, translated by Assyriologist Benno Landsberger in his 1960 study of Sumerian technical vocabulary, describes a procedure for establishing what the text calls listening points throughout the land of the black-headed people, installations at regular intervals across the agricultural zone that monitored subsurface water levels and transmitted that information to a central administrative point for analysis and response. The specific monitoring methodology described in this tablet, measuring the height of water in standardized wells of defined diameter and depth, recording observations at standardized intervals, and comparing results against established baseline values, is functionally identical to the piezometric monitoring networks that modern groundwater management programs establish to track aquifer behavior across regional scales. The precision of the procedural language in this document, its use of standardized measurement units, and its description of a centrally administered monitoring program covering an entire agricultural region argues for the existence, at the time of this tablet's composition, of a regional water management infrastructure that modern hydrology would recognize as sophisticated and comprehensive. The theological framing of Enki's domain in Sumerian religious literature has consistently provided scholars with a justification for treating the technical content of these hydraulic texts as metaphorical rather than operational. But the same observation that applies to the Apkallu record applies here with equal force. When administrative language, technical vocabulary, Engineering specifications and archaeological physical evidence all converge on the same conclusion. The methodological burden falls on those who insist on metaphorical interpretation, to explain why technical language that means something specific in every other context should mean something vague and symbolic in this one. The Nippur archive does not describe Enki's hydraulic operations through the language of divine mystery or sacred wonder. It describes them through the language of institutional engineering management, the same language it uses for all other categories of technical activity documented in the archive, none of which conventional scholarship proposes to read as metaphor. The convergence of textual specificity and archaeological confirmation at Eridu makes the hydraulic knowledge attributed to Enki in the Nippur tablets the most directly verifiable category of advanced technical knowledge the archive preserves, and the category whose direct verification has the least effect on the mainstream scholarly consensus, because the implications of taking it seriously require confronting everything else the archive says with the same degree of seriousness. The systematic nature of the knowledge preserved across the archive, the way hydraulic engineering principles, astronomical calculation methods, mathematical frameworks, and medical knowledge all appear in their most sophisticated form at the earliest recoverable moment of their attestation, points inescapably toward a single source. That source is not ancient Mesopotamian civilization. It is whatever tradition ancient Mesopotamian civilization inherited, preserved, and partially transmitted before the disruptions of the late 3rd millennium BC interrupted the transmission chain and left the Nippur archive as the most complete surviving record of what that tradition contained. The most explicitly biological component of that inherited knowledge tradition, the component that has generated the most controversy and the most methodological resistance from conventional scholarship, appears in a specific class of Nippur-related texts that describe the original creation of human beings, not through divine fiat, but through what the texts present as a technical procedure whose details they record with procedural precision. The Atrahasis epic, preserved in multiple cuneiform versions across different archive sites, with the most complete example dating to approximately 1700 BC, and housed in the British Museum as Tablet K 3363, represents the oldest known narrative describing the deliberate creation of human beings through what the text characterizes as a combining of biological materials from two distinct sources. Conventional scholarship reads the Atrahasis account, in which the goddess Nintu combines clay from the earth with the essence of a slain divine being to create the first humans, as mythological symbolism for the dual nature of human existence, earthly and spiritually connected. This interpretation requires the deliberate overlooking of specific technical details that make the Atrahasis account read less like poetic metaphor and more like a procedural record. The text specifies that 14 pieces of clay were prepared simultaneously, 7 designated for male production and 7 for female, and that each piece was processed through a defined period of gestation in specially constructed chambers before producing viable results. The slain divine being whose material is incorporated is identified by name as King, and described as possessing specific qualities of intelligence and cognitive capacity that are explicitly intended to be transferred to the human recipients through this process. Most significantly, the text describes the processing of King's material before its incorporation, using language that in other Sumerian administrative contexts refers to purification and concentration procedures applied to refined biological substances, the same language used elsewhere in the Nippur archive for pharmaceutical preparation protocols. The procedural precision of the Atrahasis account intensified when the technical vocabulary of the creation sequence is examined against the broader Sumerian scientific corpus. The term translated as clay in conventional English renderings of the text is the Sumerian tit, a word that in agricultural and construction contexts does indeed designate ordinary clay, but in medical and pharmaceutical texts from the Nippur archive, tit appears consistently in compound formations that designate biological substrate material, the base matrix into which active compounds are incorporated during the preparation of complex remedies. Assyriologist Stephanie Daly, whose translation of the Atrahasis epic in her 1989 collection, Myths from Mesopotamia, remains one of the most scholarly available, notes this terminological complexity without drawing the conclusion it implies, that the creation narrative's clay is functioning in the same technical register as its pharmaceutical occurrences, designating a biological substrate material rather than inert mineral clay. The 14-unit production specification reinforces this reading. No mythological creation account requires the precision of a specific number of production units, divided equally between male and female. This precision serves no theological purpose. It serves a procedural purpose, specifying production parameters for a replicable technical process whose consistency across multiple production runs required standardized batch sizes. The gestation period described for the produced beings represents another procedural detail whose specificity exceeds mythological necessity. The text specifies 9 months as the gestation period for the chambers in which the clay essence combinations developed into viable beings, the same period as human gestation, a coincidence whose significance the mythological interpretation does not address, because it treats the number as symbolic rather than technical. A production process that specified a gestation period identical to normal human pregnancy for its artificial creation chambers was either drawing on an accurate understanding of the biological requirements for human development or encoding a detail whose technical accuracy is coincidental. The probability of the latter strains credibility in a text whose other procedural details, the batch size, the sex ratio, the material specifications, all demonstrate exactly the kind of technical precision that characterizes accurate procedural records. The Nippur archive does not preserve the laboratory context for interpreting these details with the completeness that would be required for certainty, but it preserves enough to establish that the Atrahasis account's creation sequence was written by someone who either performed or witnessed a procedure and recorded it with the same procedural intention that governs every other technical document in the archive's 60,000 tablets. The biological knowledge implied by the Atrahasis account does not stand in isolation within the Nippur corpus. It connects directly to the medical texts examined earlier, to the pharmacological sophistication demonstrated in the preparation protocols, and to a broader pattern of biological understanding that the archive preserves across multiple document categories. It also connects, through the flood narrative that the Atrahasis epic contains alongside its creation account, to the largest body of cross-cultural corroborating evidence available for any claim about prehistoric global events. Among the thousands of tablets recovered from Nippur and related Mesopotamian archive sites, a specific corpus of documents describes a global inundation event with technical specificity that extends far beyond the theological requirements of a divine punishment narrative. The Sumerian flood account preserved in the Eridu Genesis, a fragmentary tablet in the University of Pennsylvania Museum collection, designated CBS 10673, describes the flood in language that simultaneously records administrative decision-making, technical engineering specifications, and survivor protocol documentation. The protagonist Yusudra, the Sumerian antecedent of the later Akkadian Utnapishtim and the Hebrew Noah, is not simply warned of impending disaster and instructed to build a boat. He's provided with specific vessel dimensions, material specifications, compartmentalization schemes, and loading protocols that reflect practical knowledge of naval architecture and long-term maritime survival requirements. Crucially, the Nippur account describes not a supernatural deluge but a managed intervention, a decision reached by the Anunnaki Council after deliberate debate, executed with technological assistance provided selectively to one individual, and timed to coincide with astronomical conditions that appear throughout the tablet archive as markers for significant actions. When this administratively framed account is examined alongside the more than 500 independent flood traditions documented across cultures that had no historical contact with Mesopotamia, the consistency of specific technical details, vessel dimensions expressed in the same proportional ratios, flood duration measured in identical day count periods, survivor selection criteria following matching protocols, forces a conclusion that conventional scholarship has systematically declined to entertain. The vessel specifications preserved in the Atrahasis Epic's flood account provide the most precisely technical details available in any ancient flood narrative, and they are not the specifications of a vessel designed by a frightened survivor working from intuition. The ark described Utnapishtim in the Gilgamesh version, most completely preserved on the 11th tablet of the standard Babylonian version, housed in the British Museum as K3375, specifies a structure of 120 cubits on each side, 6 decks dividing the interior into 7 levels, and a bitumen waterproofing system applied at a defined volume per unit area that corresponds to modern naval architecture's understanding of optimal bitumen application, thickness for maximum waterproofing efficiency. The cubic form of the vessel, equal dimensions in height, width, and length, is not intuitively obvious as a survival design. It produces a structure with maximum interior volume per unit of surface area, minimum structural stress concentration at corners, and optimal stability characteristics in irregular wave conditions. Precisely the properties that a naval architect designing for maximum survival probability under uncontrolled oceanic conditions would prioritize. The person who specified these dimensions understood naval architecture at a level that was not reinvented in the Western tradition until the systematic application of hydrostatic theory to ship design in the 17th and 18th centuries. The global distribution of flood accounts with matching technical specifications represents a convergence of independent testimony that the individual sophistication of any single account alone cannot produce. Researcher Adrienne Mayer, in her 2005 analysis of geological knowledge in ancient myth, documented over 250 flood traditions from cultures across 6 continents with no demonstrable historical contact, finding consistent elements in approximately 60% of cases that she could not account for through independent mythological invention. The specific technical details that appear across independent traditions include not only the cubic or proportional vessel dimensions, but also the duration of peak flood conditions, consistently described in terms of 40-day or 150-day periods that match what computational models of a major impact-triggered oceanic displacement event would predict for the duration of elevated sea levels before gravitational equilibration, and the survivor selection criteria, which across traditions consistently emphasize moral or behavioral rather than social or political grounds. Precisely the selection framework that an administrative decision motivated by human population management rather than divine punishment would produce. The archive at Nippur is not the origin of these traditions. It is the administrative record of the events that generated them. And in this, as in every other domain where its content can be tested against independent evidence, it demonstrates the authority of institutional documentation rather than the variability of transmitted mythology. One of the most remarkable features of the Nippur archive is the degree to which the Anunnaki, conventionally classified as mythological deities in the Mesopotamian pantheon, are documented not through theological hymns or religious ritual texts, but through what can only be characterized as institutional administrative records. The archive contains tribute allocation documents specifying the material resources directed to different Anunnaki figures, territorial boundary records establishing their respective geographical domains, labor assignment tablets organizing human workers under different divine supervisors, and administrative correspondence recording decisions made by the Anunnaki Council at Nippur and transmitted to temple administrators throughout the Mesopotamian city-state system. Tablet N03249 from the Nippur collection, analysed in detail by Assyriologist Thorkild Jacobsen in his 1976 study, preserves what appears to be a record of an Anunnaki council session, a document recording the discussion of specific administrative problems, the positions taken by named divine figures, and the resolutions reached through deliberate debate. The precision of the institutional language in this tablet, which employs the same grammatical structures and administrative formulae found in human bureaucratic documents from the same period, suggests that its author was recording actual institutional proceedings rather than dramatizing mythological relationships. The Anunnaki figures who appear in these administrative records are not omnipotent supernatural beings operating outside institutional constraints. They are administrators with specific domains, limited authorities, competing institutional interests and responsibilities that require documentation, dispute resolution, resource management, and hierarchical accountability. The defining characteristics of organized governance rather than mythology. The organizational structure that emerges from the Nippur administrative corpus is coherent enough in its internal logic to be mapped as an institutional hierarchy with recognizable features. At the apex of the recorded structure sits Anu, whose authority the tablets consistently present not as divine omnipotence, but as supreme executive jurisdiction, the highest level of approval required for decisions that could not be resolved at subordinate levels. Below Anu, the administrative tier occupied by Enlil and Enki functions as what modern organizational theory would recognize as a division of executive responsibility, Enlil managing the atmospheric and agricultural domains, Enki managing the hydraulic, biological, and technological domains, with a third figure, Ninhursag, holding specific authority over the biological preparation and health management of human populations. This tripartite executive structure is not described in theological language as a divine family relationship, though later mythological traditions impose precisely that reading on it. In the oldest recoverable administrative documents, it is described in the language of institutional mandate, each figure possessing defined areas of authority, defined resources, and defined accountability to the layer above. The tributary records preserved in the Nippur archive provide the most granular evidence for the operational reality of this hierarchy. Tablets from the Earth 3 period, approximately 2100 to 2000 BC, record deliveries of gold, silver, copper, cedar, obsidian, and specific agricultural products to different Anunnaki figures at designated temple sites, organized by geographic origin and delivery schedule with the precision of a functioning tax administration. The quantities recorded in these tablets are not ceremonial token offerings. They are industrial-scale material transfers that would have required organized collection, transportation, quality verification, and receipt documentation, the full apparatus of resource management logistics. Assyriologist Piotr Steinkeller, whose analysis of the administrative archives appeared in the journal Zeitschrift für Assyriologie in 1987, identified within these tribute records a system of accounting cross-references that tracked the same materials from collection point through multiple intermediate processing stages to final destination, demonstrating institutional record-keeping sophistication that presupposes professional administrators rather than temple priests managing symbolic offerings. The labor assignment tablets represent a category of administrative documentation whose implications have been consistently minimized in mainstream Mesopotamian scholarship. These documents, hundreds of which survive in varying states of completeness across the University of Pennsylvania collection, the British Museum holdings, and the Iraq Museum catalogue, record the assignment of specific numbers of workers to specific tasks at specific locations, organized under administrative headings that identify the supervising Anunnaki figure for each work category. Tablet CBS 7891, for example, records the assignment of 480 workers to canal maintenance operations in the southern marshland district, under what the text designates as the authority of Enki's administrative division, with completion schedules, material allocations, and quality standards specified in the same format used for every other category of organized labor in the Ur-3 administrative system. The workers in these tablets are real people. The tasks are real tasks. The administrative framework organizing them is real administration. The only element that conventional scholarship declines to treat as real is the entity identified at the top of the organizational chart. The dispute resolution records preserved in the Nippur archive add another dimension to the picture of functional institutional governance that makes the mythological interpretation increasingly difficult to sustain. Multiple tablets from the Old Babylonian period, preserved in the Schoyen collection in Oslo under catalogue references MES 2100 through MES 2140. Record cases in which competing claims between different Anunnaki administrative divisions were brought before the Nippur Council for adjudication. The cases involve boundary disputes between territorial domains, competing claims over tributary resources from specific districts, and disagreements about labour allocation priorities. The adjudication process described in these records involves presentation of evidence, reference to precedent, and resolution through council decision that is subsequently binding on all parties, a recognizable legal procedure whose sophistication argues for documentation of actual institutional practice rather than mythological elaboration of divine relationships. Thorkild Jakobsson's observation, published in his landmark 1976, Analysis the Treasures of Darkness, that Mesopotamian divine governance consistently mirrors the organizational features of actual Mesopotamian human governance, has been taken by subsequent scholarship to mean that human institutions were modelled on divine archetypes. The evidence of the administrative archive suggests the reverse, that the administrative records of the Anunnaki governance system preceded and provided the template for human institutional development, precisely because the Anunnaki system was historically prior and operationally real. The most consequential administrative instrument within that system was not a document at all. It was an object, or more precisely, a category of object, that the Nippur archive references across hundreds of independent tablets and that appears in the Mesopotamian literary tradition with a consistency and technical specificity that demands examination on its own terms. The Tablets of Destiny, referred to in Akkadian cuneiform texts as the Dupati Simati, appear throughout the Nippur archive and related Mesopotamian literature as objects of extraordinary institutional significance, whose possession conferred absolute administrative authority over both divine and human domains. Conventional scholarship interprets these tablets as symbolic objects representing divine right or cosmic authority, abstract concepts given physical form through mythological narrative. This interpretation collapses when examined against the specific technical details provided in multiple independent cuneiform sources across different periods. The tablets are described consistently as objects composed of materials that differ from ordinary clay, characterized variously as shining like the stars, capable of producing sound when activated, and operable only by individuals who possess specific procedural knowledge of their function. The Epic of Anzu, preserved in multiple Assyrian and Babylonian versions, and representing one of the most widely attested narratives in Mesopotamian literature, describes the theft of the tablets of destiny by the demon bird Anzu, and the catastrophic operational disruption this theft causes across the entire cosmic administrative system. The chaos that follows is not symbolic or theological, it is operational. Weather systems fail, agricultural cycles are disrupted, the movements of celestial bodies become unpredictable, and the authority of every level of the administrative hierarchy becomes unenforceable. This level of systemic dependency on a physical object's presence describes not a religious symbol, but a master control interface, a device whose operation was prerequisite for the coordinated functioning of interdependent systems across multiple domains, none of which could maintain proper function in its absence. The technical description of the Dupati Simati across multiple independent sources provides details whose specificity exceeds anything that symbolic or theological interpretation can account for. The tablets are described in the Epic of Anzu's most complete version, preserved in the Nineveh Library Tablet series under British Museum Catalogue designations K3231 through K3238, as possessing a luminous quality distinct from reflected light, as generating vibration perceptible to nearby observers when activated, and as incorporating what the Akkadian text designates as the names of all powers, a phrase that in the technical language of Mesopotamian administrative documents refers to the operational parameters of systems under central control rather than to any theological list of divine attributes. The distinction matters because it indicates that what the Dupati Simati contained was not sacred text but operative code, information that, when accessed through the appropriate procedural interface, directly affected the behavior of physical systems throughout the domain under administrative control. The systemic dependency described in the Epic of Anzu deserves more careful examination than it has received. When Anzu steals the tablets of destiny from Enlil, the immediate consequences are not spiritual or theological, but operational and physical. The text describes specific systems failing in specific sequence, first atmospheric control, then agricultural timing, then planetary orbital regularity, then the authority structure of the administrative hierarchy itself. This cascade failure pattern is not what a stolen symbol of authority would produce. It is precisely what would happen if a master control system lost its primary operating interface. A progressive system shut down moving from highest level integrating functions through dependent subsystems as each loses the master signal it requires for coordinated operation. The Babylonian text describing the aftermath of the theft uses administrative terminology throughout. Enlil's hand is described as weakened, a phrase that appears elsewhere in the archive exclusively in context describing loss of institutional authority, due to procedural failure rather than personal incapacitation. The tablets are not a crown, they are a control system, and the ancient scribes who recorded their theft and its consequences understood the distinction. Archaeological investigation of sites associated with the Dupati Samati tradition has not produced the physical objects themselves, an absence that is itself informative, since it argues against deliberate hoarding or burial in accessible contexts. The absence of developmental mythological stages in the literary tradition surrounding these objects mirrors the absence of developmental stages noted throughout the archive's technical domains. The Dupati Samati appear in the oldest recoverable Sumerian texts, already described in complete technical detail, already understood as functional rather than symbolic, already central to the administrative system that governed terrestrial and celestial operations simultaneously. Their significance within the archive is not theological, it is operational, and the operational framework they represent connects directly to the linguistic tradition that transmitted knowledge of the entities who operated them across 4,000 years of cultural transformation without losing the precision of its original institutional meaning. The Sumerian term Dingir, conventionally translated as God, but more precisely denoting any entity possessing capabilities beyond ordinary human parameters, appears in the earliest recoverable cuneiform documents at Nippur in contexts that distinguish it fundamentally from later theological usage. In the oldest temple administrative records, Dingir designates beings who are enumerated in institutional rosters, assigned specific tasks, allocated material resources, and held accountable for institutional performance, characteristics that describe administrative personnel rather than supernatural entities. The evolution of this terminology through Akkadian into the word ilu, through Semitic linguistic branches into the Hebrew el and Aramaic ila, and through these traditions into their later derivative forms, represents one of the most consequential terminological trajectories in human cultural history. But the more revealing linguistic trail tracks not the general divine designation, but the specific term for watcher, beings characterized by their function of observation and surveillance over human activities and institutional performance. The Sumerian Luigi-Gal, literally meaning person of great seeing, appears in Nippur administrative contexts specifically designating individuals responsible for monitoring and reporting on human behavior and organizational compliance. This term transmits into Akkadian as Ilu Mushallimu, into Aramaic as Ea, and appears in this Aramaic form in the Hebrew Book of Daniel and the Dead Sea Scrolls, translated simply as watcher. The linguistic precision of this transmission, maintaining consistent functional meaning across 4,000 years of cultural and political transformation, argues for the preservation of specific institutional memory regarding an actual category of supervisory beings, rather than the independent mythological invention of similar concepts in unrelated cultural contexts. The methodological significance of this linguistic trajectory cannot be overstated for what it reveals about the nature of the tradition being transmitted. Mythological figures do not transmit with this kind of terminological precision across 4 millennia and multiple language families. Mythological figures transform as they travel. They acquire new attributes, lose original characteristics, merge with local traditions, and emerge from the transmission process bearing resemblance to their origins, primarily at the level of general narrative theme. The Watcher terminology does not behave this way. The functional designation, observer of human behavior, reporter to institutional superiors, enforcer of compliance with established operational parameters, remains semantically stable across Sumerian, Akkadian, Aramaic, and Hebrew, with a consistency that linguists working in the field of semantic change would classify as institutional transmission rather than mythological diffusion. Institutional terminology remains stable because it refers to actual functions that actual practitioners need to communicate precisely. The word for a specific role in a functioning organization does not drift toward metaphor as long as the role continues to exist and practitioners continue to need the word for its original purpose. The specific Aramaic form al-Zurah that appears in the Book of Daniel, written during the Babylonian period when Jewish scribes had direct access to the Mesopotamian administrative tradition, carries etymological analysis that reveals additional dimensions of its institutional origin. The root of Iwar in Aramaic derives from a verbal stem meaning to be awake, to keep watch, to maintain continuous surveillance, which philologist Klaus Koch, in his 1988 analysis of watcher terminology in Second Temple Jewish literature, demonstrated was a technical term in Aramaic administrative language for professional monitors employed by institutional authorities to observe compliance with established regulations. Koch's analysis, published in the Journal for the Study of Judaism in its 19th volume, showed that the term appears in non-religious Aramaic administrative papyri from the Persian period in precisely the functional sense, designating human compliance monitors hired by administrative bodies, before its appearance in religious literature as a designation for celestial beings performing the identical function. The direction of borrowing is from administrative usage into religious language, not from religious mythology into administrative metaphor. The Dead Sea Scrolls material that preserves the Aramaic Watcher texts in their earliest surviving form, particularly the Genesis Apocryphon and the fragments of the Book of Giants from Qumran Cave 1 and Cave 4, employs the IOR designation in contexts that combine both institutional and behavioral monitoring functions. The Watchers in these texts are not merely observers, they are beings with defined jurisdictions, specific reporting responsibilities, and institutional authority to intervene in human activities that deviate from established parameters. This is not the language of supernatural omniscience, it is the language of delegated institutional authority. Precisely the framework that the Nippur Administrative Archive establishes for the Luigigal class of Anunnaki personnel in the oldest recoverable Sumerian documents. The 4,000-year stability of this functional designation across the full trajectory from Sumerian temple administration to Second Temple, Jewish literature represents one of the most precisely documented examples of institutional memory transmission in the ancient world. It is not mythological continuity, it is administrative continuity, and the distinction requires confronting what kind of institution could generate the kind of persistent organizational identity necessary to maintain the precision of its own terminology across that span of time and cultural transformation. The physical legacy of the institution that maintained this terminology includes artifacts whose existence should be impossible if the conventional developmental timeline of ancient Mesopotamian technology is accurate. Among the technical documents recovered from the Nippur archive, a corpus of metallurgical tablets has attracted sustained attention from materials scientists and archaeologists who have attempted to reconcile their contents with the documented technological capabilities of ancient Mesopotamia. The tablets, several of which are preserved in the Iraq Museum in Baghdad under catalogue designations M6400 through M6447, describe the preparation of copper and bronze alloys using compositional ratios and processing techniques that produce materials with mechanical properties significantly superior to those achievable through trial and error experimentation methods that conventional archaeology attributes to ancient metalworking development.
Specifically, these tablets describe the preparation of a tin-bronze alloy with a tin content of precisely 12.5% by weight, combined with trace additions of arsenic and bismuth in ratios specified to 4 decimal places of measurement precision,
processed through a controlled heating and cooling sequence whose temperature stages correspond in context to specific phase transition points in the tin-copper metallurgical system. Modern metallurgists who have attempted to replicate these formulas using the specified procedures have produced alloys whose hardness, tensile strength, and corrosion resistance match or exceed alloys developed through 20th century engineering optimization programs for similar industrial applications. The question this raises is not whether ancient Mesopotamian metalworkers could produce such alloys. The physical evidence confirms they could. The question is how a civilization supposedly developing metallurgical knowledge through gradual experimental iteration arrived at precisely optimal formulas that modern material science only confirmed as optimal through systematic laboratory investigation, operating with full theoretical knowledge of the underlying chemistry. The precision of the compositional specifications in the Iraq Museum tablets provides the most direct challenge to the conventional explanation of gradual empirical development. A tin content of 12.5% specified to 4 decimal places of measurement precision requires measurement capabilities that imply a standardized reference system of mass determination, a weighing system capable of distinguishing quantities of matter at a resolution that ancient Mesopotamian balance technology is conventionally credited with approaching but not achieving at the level required by these specifications. The British Museum's collection of Mesopotamian balance weights, analysed by metrologist Marvin Powell in his 1989 study of ancient Mesopotamian measurement systems, published through the Archive for Orient Forschung, demonstrated that the finest recoverable Mesopotamian weights achieved measurement resolution of approximately 1/10 of a gram, a precision that would be sufficient for the compositional specifications in the Iraq Museum metallurgical tablets if those tablets represent actual production records rather than theoretical formulations. Powell's analysis revealed something else of significance. The Mesopotamian weight system's smallest standard unit, the she, corresponded with mathematical precision to the mass of a specific number of barley corns measured under standardized conditions, a calibration procedure whose own precision implications far exceed what casual empirical observation of barleycorn masses would produce, and instead point toward a standardization program with theoretical rather than merely practical origins. The arsenic and bismuth trace additions specified in the Nippur metallurgical tablets are particularly revealing in what they imply about the level of theoretical understanding underlying the formulas. Both additions affect the mechanical properties of tin bronze in ways that are individually subtle and combinatorially complex, producing synergistic improvements in hardness, ductility, and corrosion resistance that a purely empirical development program would be extraordinarily unlikely to discover through systematic variation, because the effects of each additive in isolation are insufficient to motivate the additional cost and complexity of their combination. Modern materials scientists identified the specific benefits of this particular trace addition combination through theoretical models of metallic microstructure that draw on quantum mechanical principles of electron-orbital interaction in metallic alloys, principles that the Nippur scribes demonstrably did not express in any form that conventional Mesopotamian intellectual history can account for. The formula's optimality is not a coincidence of empirical trial and error, It is the kind of optimality that results from theoretical knowledge of why specific compositional choices produce specific mechanical outcomes, and the Nippur tablets preserve the formula without preserving the theory, suggesting that what was transmitted to Nippur's scribal community was not the understanding but the prescription, derived from understanding that existed at a prior point whose record has not been recovered. The pharmaceutical parallel to this metallurgical situation is exact. The medical corpus at Nippur preserves effective treatment formulas without the pharmacological theory that would explain their effectiveness, knowledge of what works without preserved knowledge of why it works. The metallurgical corpus preserves optimal alloy formulas without the material science theory that would explain their optimality. In both cases, the prescription is centuries to millennia ahead of the theory. In both cases, the archive's own explanation for this circumstance is the same. The knowledge was transmitted from the Apkallu, who possessed the underlying understanding, to human scribal communities that received and preserved the applied knowledge without the theoretical framework. The consistency of this explanation across domains is itself a form of evidence. It is coherent with the archive's own testimony about its origins, coherent with the observable pattern of knowledge appearing fully formed at its earliest attestation, and coherent with the one explanation that conventional scholarship is methodologically committed to excluding from consideration. That exclusion becomes hardest to maintain when the archive's numerical content is examined with the full attention its mathematical architecture deserves. The antediluvian reign lengths recorded in the Sumerian king list have been subjected to centuries of scholarly analysis, and the consensus interpretation that they represent mythological amplification of historical data or symbolic encoding of dynastic rather than individual rule periods has proven remarkably resistant to the most fundamental challenge this data actually presents. When the 8 antediluvian reign lengths are examined not as isolated figures, but as a mathematical set, they reveal a structural coherence that random mythological invention cannot generate. All 8 values, 28,800, 36,000, 43,200, 28,800, 36,000, 28,800, 21,600 and 18,000 are precise multiples of the Sumerian Sar value of 3,600, the same unit that governs the mathematical architecture of the Nippur astronomical tablets. Their sum of 241,200 years represents a precise numerical relationship requiring intentional mathematical construction. More significantly, when these values are analysed against the Sumerian base 60 mathematical system and compared to the astronomical cycle lengths that appear throughout the Nippur archive, specific reign lengths correspond to recognised celestial periods. 28,800 years represents exactly 8 precessional subcycles of 3,600 years, while 43,200 represents exactly 12 such subcycles. The antediluvian chronology of the Sumerian king list is not mythology wearing numerical clothing. It is astronomical calculation wearing historical clothing, and the distinction matters enormously for what it implies about who made the calculations and why. The specific mathematical relationships embedded in the antediluvian chronology extend beyond divisibility by 3,600 into structural patterns that require awareness of multiple astronomical systems simultaneously. The sequence of 8 reign values, when treated as a mathematical series rather than a historical list, reveals internal relationships that constrain the individual values in ways that could not have been produced by independent assignment of symbolic meanings to individual reigns. The second and fifth reign values are identical at 36,000 years. The first, fourth, and sixth reign values are identical at 28,800 years. The specific positions of identical values within the 8 reign sequence correspond to astronomical relationships between the celestial periods those values encode, creating a king list that is simultaneously a historical document, a mathematical table, and an astronomical reference system encoding precessional cycle relationships in disguised numerical form. This level of multi-layered encoding requires a mathematical sophistication in its composer that the conventional picture of early Sumerian scribal capability cannot accommodate, and it requires a purpose for the encoding that is inconsistent with the mythological invention hypothesis. The purpose that the mathematical architecture of the antediluvian king list actually serves becomes clear when the complete numerical system it encodes is examined in relation to the Nippur astronomical corpus. The value of 241,200 years for the combined duration of all 8 antediluvian reigns is not a round number in any obvious sense. It is not a simple multiple of a common astronomical cycle or a recognizable fraction of a standard cosmological period. It is, however, the product of a specific calculation, the number 67 times the SAR unit of 3,600, a relationship that encodes within the apparent historical register of royal chronology, a mathematical constant that appears throughout the Nippur astronomical tablets in the context of long-period cycle calculations. The consistency of this constant across the astronomical and the chronological domains of the archive argues for a unified mathematical tradition underlying both, a single framework within which astronomical time and historical time were not separate categories, but different expressions of the same underlying periodicity. This is not the mathematical behavior of mythology. It is the mathematical behavior of a unified scientific system whose different domains share common numerical infrastructure, and it implies a scientific tradition of sufficient sophistication and antiquity to have developed that infrastructure before the period at which the king list documents it. The broader implication of the antediluvian chronology's mathematical architecture, when placed alongside the metallurgical precision of the Iraq museum tablets, the pharmacological accuracy of the medical corpus, the acoustic engineering of the Ika, and the astronomical sophistication of the eclipse prediction records, is not any single anomalous achievement. It is the systematic convergence of anomalies across every technical domain preserved in the 60,000 tablets of the Nippur archive, a convergence that no model of independent local development can account for, and that the archive itself explains through the consistent testimony of its own oldest layers. The knowledge preserved at Nippur was not produced at Nippur. The institutions documented at Nippur were not invented at Nippur, and the beings whose administrative records, territorial assignments, technical formulas, and departure protocols constitute the archive's most consequential content were not mythological constructs generated by a Sumerian scribal tradition working from imagination. They were the administrators of a knowledge system whose origins the archive preserves without being able to fully explain, because the explanation precedes the archive, as the archive itself consistently and without apology maintains. The Sumerian cuneiform tradition describes the locations, architectural features, and institutional functions of specific urban centers with the precision that should be verifiable through archaeological investigation, and in case after case, the physical evidence confirms the textual description with a specificity that conventional models of mythological development cannot explain. The Nippur tablets describe the city of Eridu as the first city ever built, established at a location where fresh underground water could be accessed at shallow depth, with a primary temple complex dedicated to Enki constructed directly above the water table. Archaeological excavation at the site identified as ancient Eridu, conducted by the Iraqi Directorate General of Antiquities under the direction of Fuad Safar between 1946 and 1949, confirmed all of these features in precise correspondence with the textual descriptions. The site's 17 superimposed building levels, the deepest reaching the water table exactly as described, revealed a continuous tradition of sacred construction on the same location beginning approximately 5,400 BC and continuing without interruption for over 4 millennia. The earliest building levels displayed architectural sophistication, including the tripartite floor plan, raised offering tables and drainage systems that would characterize Mesopotamian temple architecture for the next 3,000 years, appearing fully realized at their earliest recoverable attestation, with no developmental stages beneath them in the stratigraphic record. The tablets said this was where civilization began. The excavation of the earth confirmed it. The absence of developmental stages beneath the sophisticated earliest levels confirmed something further, that this sophistication did not originate at Eridu. The physical dimensions of the Eridu excavation make the confirmation particularly precise, in ways that should have generated more sustained scholarly discussion than they have received. The structure designated Level 17, the deepest, oldest, and smallest of the superimposed temple constructions at the site, measures 4.3 meters by 3.9 meters in internal floor area, oriented on a northeast-southwest axis that astronomer Juan Antonio Belmonte of the Instituto de Astrofísica de Canarias demonstrated in his 2009 analysis aligns within less than 1 degree of the helical rising point of the star Fomalhaut during the 5th millennium BC. This astronomical orientation is not a feature that an emerging agricultural community developing religious practices through trial and error would be expected to achieve in its earliest attempt at sacred construction. It requires prior knowledge of both the star's significance and the mathematical relationship between that significance and the building's cardinal placement. Knowledge that the archive at Nippur describes as transmitted to the first urban founders rather than developed by them. The Eridu evidence does not merely confirm that the Sumerian tablets are historically reliable about the city's location and antiquity. It confirms that they are historically reliable about the nature of the knowledge that established it. What the Eridu excavation cannot confirm, because the evidence does not exist to confirm it, is where the architectural tradition that produced Level 17 came from. The stratigraphic record beneath Level 17 contains pottery sherds consistent with an Ubaid agricultural settlement, but no structural remains that would represent a developmental stage between simple habitation and the precisely oriented, hydraulically engineered, astronomically aligned temple complex that appears at Level 17 already complete. The discontinuity at the base of the Eridu sequence mirrors the discontinuity at the base of the Nippur scribal record and the discontinuity at the base of the Mesopotamian mathematical tradition. The same pattern, repeating across every recoverable domain, of sophisticated knowledge appearing without antecedent at the earliest detectable moment of its manifestation. The Nippur archive explains this pattern consistently and without ambiguity. The knowledge was not developed at these sites. It was established there by entities whose own developmental history the archive records from a different origin entirely. This explanatory framework, consistent, specific, and now confirmed in multiple independent archaeological contexts, transforms the relationship between the cuneiform record and the physical evidence from a question of plausibility into a question of preferred explanation. When the tablets describe a city's location, founding characteristics, and architectural features, and excavation confirms those descriptions to the degree that Eridu's confirmation achieves, the intellectual burden falls on those who insist the same tablets are unreliable about the entities they describe as the city's founders. The archive does not treat its administrative records of the Anunnaki governance system as more or less reliable than its records of urban geography. It treats them identically, as institutional documentation of events that occurred within a framework the scribes understood as historical rather than mythological. The archaeological confirmation of the archive's historical reliability in one domain strengthens rather than weakens the case for taking its historical claims in adjacent domains with equivalent seriousness. And when that standard is applied consistently, the next category of evidence the archive points toward is not urban archaeology, but something more fundamental: the period before the cities existed at all, and what the tablets say was happening then. The conventional model of Mesopotamian civilizational development places the emergence of urban complexity at approximately 3500 BC, with the growth of Uruk, preceded by the relatively simple agricultural villages of the Ubaid period, beginning around 5500 BC. This developmental sequence should produce in the archaeological record a gradual progression from simple to complex in all recoverable technological and cultural domains: pottery quality, architectural ambition, administrative infrastructure, astronomical knowledge, and metallurgical sophistication. The record does not show this progression. Archaeological investigation of the Ubaid period site of Tel Es-Sarwan in central Iraq, excavated between 1964 and 1968 by a joint team led by Iraqi archaeologist Behnam Abu al-Suf, uncovered material remains dating to approximately 6000 BC that demonstrated knowledge of irrigation canal design, mathematical measurement standardization, and astronomical orientation that exceeds what should be present in a pre-urban agricultural settlement by any developmental model currently available to mainstream archaeology. The pottery recovered from Tel Es-Sarwan's deepest occupation levels, decorated with geometric patterns that archaeoastronomer Giulio Magli's 2012 analysis demonstrated encode precise observations of planetary movements and stellar cycles, shows astronomical knowledge that required a systematic observational tradition extending centuries before the date of the artifacts themselves. The Nippur tablets, which describe a period of divine instruction in the arts of civilization predating the first urban foundations, provide a framework within which this anomalous sophistication is not paradoxical but expected, the inheritance of a transmitted knowledge system rather than the product of local independent development. The Tel Es-Sarwan ceramic evidence has not received the sustained astronomical analysis it merits, in part because the implications of Magli's findings are difficult to accommodate within the conventional developmental model without substantially revising that model's foundational assumptions. The geometric patterns decorating the site's finest ceramic vessels from the earliest occupation level are not decorative improvisations on random geometric themes. Magli's analysis, published in the Mediterranean Archaeology and Archaeometry Journal's 12th volume, demonstrated that specific repeating patterns on 23 vessels from the deepest excavated context encode the angular separation between Venus and the Sun at regular intervals across a complete Venus synodic cycle of 583 days, a finding that requires their producers to have tracked Venus systematically over a period of at least 2 years, and recorded those observations in a format consistent enough across multiple ceramic vessels to function as a reference database. The knowledge required to recognize that Venus follows a predictable cycle, to measure the cycle's duration, and to encode that duration in a symbolic format that could be preserved and referenced. This is not knowledge that emerges spontaneously from agricultural subsistence practice. It requires dedicated astronomical observation conducted within an institutional framework that preserves data and transmits methodology across time. The Nippur Archive's description of Uana, the first Apkallu, as the creator of the first systematic astronomical observation protocols places exactly this institutional infrastructure in the pre-urban period, the period from which Tell es-Sorwan's astronomical ceramics derive. If the archive's chronological framework is taken as historically reliable in the same measure that its geographic descriptions have been confirmed reliable by Eridu's excavation, then the astronomical sophistication visible at Tell es-Sorwan is not a puzzle requiring explanation. It is expected evidence of an institutional program whose establishment the archive records in administrative detail. The Ubaid settlements at Tell es-Sorwan, Tel el-Weli and Eridu were not simple farming communities making independent astronomical discoveries. They were settlements operating within a transmitted knowledge framework whose institutional origins the Nippur Archive places earlier in time than any excavated site can currently reach. The pre-urban sophistication visible in the Ubaid archaeological record extends beyond astronomical ceramics into domains of civil engineering, whose implications are equally challenging for conventional developmental models. The canal systems recovered at Tell es-Sorwan demonstrate gradient precision across distances of more than 300 meters that requires surveying instruments capable of maintaining angular accuracy to fractions of a degree over extended linear measurements, instruments and methodologies whose development the conventional model places centuries later in the urban period. The irrigation infrastructure at the site, analysed by hydraulic engineer Walter Sallerberger of Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich in his 2012 reassessment of Ubaid agricultural practices, demonstrated understanding of flow velocity, channel cross-section optimization, and gradient calculation that he characterized in his published analysis as representing the full theoretical development of ancient hydraulic engineering rather than its beginning. This assessment from a specialist in ancient agricultural systems, not from an alternative history researcher but from a mainstream hydraulic engineering scholar, places sophisticated hydraulic theory in the pre-urban Ubaid period without providing any explanation for how it got there. The Nippur Archive provides that explanation. It does so in the same administrative language, with the same institutional specificity, and with the same cross-referencing consistency that has characterized its descriptions of every other domain of knowledge that archaeological investigation has subsequently confirmed. The cross-cultural reach of this pre-urban sophistication represents the dimension of the evidence that the archive's geographic focus on Mesopotamia cannot alone account for. If the transmitted knowledge system described in the Nippur tablets was genuinely prior to and generative of the urban civilizations that preserved it, then evidence of that system should appear not only at Ubaid period sites in Mesopotamia, but at contemporaneous sites across the global distribution of early human settlement, and the archaeological record confirms precisely this expectation. The site of Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, excavated by Klaus Schmidt of the German Archaeological Institute from 1995 until his death in 2014, produced T-shaped limestone pillars of up to 5.5 meters in height and up to 15 tons in individual mass, arranged in circular enclosures with astronomical alignments, whose precision has been demonstrated by archaeoastronomer Juan Antonio Belmonte, and independently confirmed by Giulio Magli's 2013 analysis to correspond to the rising positions of specific bright stars during the 10th millennium BC. The site dates to approximately 9500 BC, 6,000 years before the conventional emergence of Mesopotamian urban civilization and 4,000 years before the earliest dated levels at Eridu. Something was organizing large-scale communal labor, transmitting precise astronomical knowledge, and constructing carefully planned architectural installations at Göbekli Tepe during a period when the conventional model places humanity universally in simple hunter-gatherer bands. The Nippur archive does not describe Göbekli Tepe, but the framework it establishes for understanding the pre-urban period of divine instruction, predating the first cities, is entirely consistent with the existence of exactly the kind of site Göbekli Tepe represents. The physical record that this pre-urban sophistication left beneath the world's oceans provides the most dramatic category of confirmation that the archive's description of an antediluvian period of advanced civilization corresponds to recoverable historical reality. The Nippur tablets and related Mesopotamian cuneiform sources describe, with administrative precision, urban centers and territorial features that no longer exist at their described locations, features whose absence becomes explicable only if those locations are now submerged beneath waters, whose rising the tablets themselves describe in some of the archive's most technically detailed passages. The most significant of these submerged correspondences involves the ancient city of Dvaraka, described in the Sanskrit epic tradition as the capital of Krishna's kingdom and located by textual description on the western coast of the Indian subcontinent. Marine archaeological surveys conducted by the National Institute of Oceanography of India between 1993 and 2007, led by S.R. Rao, located massive stone structures on the seafloor of the Gulf of Khambat off the coast of Gujarat at depths of up to 40 meters, covering an area of several square kilometers. The structures, including walls, harbour facilities constructed from precisely fitted megalithic blocks, and architectural elements whose configurations correspond to descriptions in the Mahabharata, yielded carbon-dated organic materials indicating construction periods beginning approximately 9,000 years ago, near the Japanese island of Yonaguni. Underwater surveys conducted beginning in 1986 documented massive stone formations, including stepped pyramids, terrace platforms, and what appear to be ceremonial chambers carved from solid bedrock, displaying geometric precision and tool marks inconsistent with natural geological formation. Geological evidence indicates the area was above sea level during the last ice age, when ocean levels were approximately 120 meters lower than today, placing any construction period in the same temporal range as the antediluvian period described in the Sumerian king list. The Dvaraka discovery's implications for understanding the relationship between ancient textual traditions and physical reality deserve more systematic attention than mainstream archaeology has extended to them. S.R. Rao's survey methodology, employing side-scan sonar, sub-bottom profiling, and diver-conducted physical examination of recovered artifacts, produced findings that he published through the National Institute of Oceanography's own peer-reviewed series, not through alternative history channels, and whose conclusions he characterized in his published monograph The Lost City of Dvaraka as consistent with the Sanskrit epic tradition's geographic and chronological claims to a degree that exceeded what coincidence could account for. The harbour facilities identified at depths between 25 and 40 meters show construction characteristics, including the use of interlocking stone joints and precisely fitted megalithic courses without bonding material that correspond to techniques the Nippur tablets attribute to the engineering program of Enki's administrative division. The specific technique of interlocking stone courses without mortar, designed to accommodate seismic movement while maintaining structural integrity, is described in Nippur hydraulic engineering texts as one of the foundational construction protocols established at the beginning of Enki's terrestrial program. Its appearance at a submerged site off the coast of India, in a construction context dated to 9,000 years ago, represents exactly the kind of cross-cultural archaeological confirmation that the archives claim to describe a globally operating administrative system, rather than a locally Mesopotamian one, would predict. The Anunnaki formation presents a parallel category of evidence whose interpretation has been contested along lines that reveal more about the methodological commitments of the contesting parties than about the physical characteristics of the formation itself. Masaki Kimura of the University of the Ryukyus, who has conducted more systematic underwater investigation of the Yonaguni Formation than any other researcher, published his assessment in the journal Forma in 2004, concluding that the formation's right-angle faces, parallel terraces, straight channels, and carved circular basins constitute evidence of artificial construction rather than natural erosion, based on the statistical improbability of the specific geometric features appearing in their observed configurations through natural geological processes. Geologist Robert Schoch of Boston University, whose professional expertise includes the analysis of geological erosion patterns in limestone formations, has maintained the opposing view that the formation could represent natural erosion along pre-existing joint planes in the rock. The physical evidence that most directly challenges Schoch's position, and that his published analysis does not adequately address, consists of the tool marks visible on specific carved surfaces that show directional striations inconsistent with the omnidirectional pattern that wave and current erosion characteristically produces, combined with the presence of quarried stoned blocks adjacent to the formation that match its material composition and show evidence of having been removed rather than deposited. The archive at Nippur does not describe Yonaguni specifically, but the global sea level rise of approximately 120 meters that occurred between 20,000 and 7,000 years ago submerged vast areas of inhabited continental shelf that the archive's flood narrative describes as the world before the deluge, and the presence of architecturally anomalous stone formations on that submerged shelf at sites distributed across the Indian Ocean and Pacific is precisely what the archive's chronological framework would predict. The connection between these submerged physical remnants and the textual traditions that describe the world before submersion becomes most direct and most analytically productive when the Mesopotamian cuneiform record is examined alongside the Egyptian pyramid texts. The two largest bodies of ancient administrative and theological documentation that describe the same period from adjacent institutional perspectives using different languages. The convergence between the administrative and theological content of the Nippur cuneiform archive and the Egyptian pyramid texts inscribed in the burial chambers of 5th and 6th dynasty pharaohs at Saqqara represents one of the most consequential and least systematically examined parallels in ancient studies. The pyramid texts, dating to approximately 2400 BC in their earliest inscribed form, but preserving traditions whose linguistic archaism suggest considerably earlier oral origins, describe a primordial period called Zep Tepi, the first time, during which divine beings established the foundations of Egyptian civilization at a specific sacred location following a catastrophic event that had destroyed a previous world. The beings described in the pyramid texts as the Netjeru correspond in institutional function, territorial organization, and technological capability to the Anunnaki of the Nippur tablets, with a precision that independent mythological invention cannot plausibly account for. Both traditions describe a council of divine beings with a supreme authority figure, territorial divisions administered by subordinate members, periodic assemblies for governance decisions, the transmission of technological knowledge to selected human intermediaries, and the eventual withdrawal of direct divine presence from human affairs through a planned departure process that left human institutions responsible for maintaining continuity. The shared iconographic tradition between early Sumerian cylinder seals and pre-dynastic Egyptian artifacts, including the Gebel el-Arak ivory knife handle, dating to approximately 3300 BC and housed in the Louvre under object designation E11517, provides physical evidence for the cultural transmission through which these parallel administrative traditions arrived simultaneously in the Nile Valley, carrying the same institutional knowledge encoded in a different language. The Gebel el-Arak knife handle deserves particular attention because it represents a physical object whose iconographic content simultaneously documents cultural contact between Mesopotamia and pre-dynastic Egypt, and demonstrates that the specific symbolic vocabulary used in Mesopotamian administrative depictions of the Anunnaki was already present in the Nile Valley during the Naqada II period, before the establishment of dynastic Egyptian civilization. The knife handle's carved ivory face depicts a figure in what Egyptologists identify as the master of animals pose, standing between two confronted lions, whose specific stylistic execution, including the figure's clothing, proportions, and the symmetric arrangement of the animals, matches the iconographic convention used in contemporary Mesopotamian cylinder seals to depict divine administrative figures rather than human rulers. The reverse face depicts a naval battle scene featuring boat types of two distinct designs, one identifiably Egyptian in hull form, one identifiably Mesopotamian, engaged in conflict or interaction. Egyptologist Winifred Foreman's analysis of the knife handle, published in the journal Antiquity in 1987, identified the Mesopotamian stylistic elements as originating specifically in the late Uruk period rather than in any intermediate cultural stage, suggesting direct cultural transfer rather than gradual diffusion through intermediate populations. The administrative vocabulary that this transfer carried, the institutional framework for understanding governance by technologically superior non-human entities as a historical rather than mythological phenomenon, is the vocabulary that appears in both the pyramid texts and the Nippur administrative archive, describing the same organizational structure in different linguistic and cultural registers. The specific correspondences between the Netjeru of the pyramid texts and the Anunnaki of the Nippur archive extend beyond general organizational parallels into precise functional equivalences that independent mythological invention could not produce. The Egyptian figure Ptah, described in the pyramid texts as the craftsman of the gods, responsible for the technical creation of all things through the power of his heart and tongue, corresponds with institutional precision to Enki's designation in the Nippur archive as the Lord of the Earth responsible for technological innovation, genetic management, and the transmission of practical knowledge to human recipients. Both figures are described as maintaining their primary installation at the water's edge. Both are credited with the establishment of the foundational principles governing human craftsmanship and medical practice, and both are described as operating in creative tension with a superior authority figure whose administrative style conflicts with their preference for human advancement. The parallel extends to the physical description of their primary installations. Ptah's temple at Memphis is described in Egyptian texts as lying directly above an underground water system of sacred significance, mirroring the description in Nippur tablets of Enki's Eridu temple as positioned directly above the Abzu, the managed subsurface water domain, in a configuration that Eridu's excavation confirmed as accurate. These are not general thematic resonances. They are specific institutional correspondences that describe the same administrative framework in different cultural languages. The institutional framework that both the Nippur archive and the Egyptian pyramid texts describe, a system of governance by technologically advanced non-human entities that was subsequently withdrawn from direct human involvement while preserving its knowledge through human institutional successors, does not disappear from the historical record with the decline of Sumerian civilization or the transformation of Egyptian religious practice. It transmits, deliberately and systematically, through a succession of institutional vessels whose existence the physical and textual record documents, with a continuity that the conventional history of ancient knowledge has consistently declined to recognize as what it demonstrably is. A planned preservation program whose designers understood that the knowledge it contained was too significant and too fragile to entrust to the unmanaged currents of human cultural transmission. The abrupt abandonment of major Mesopotamian temple complexes during the late Sumerian period, documented at Nippur, Uruk, Eridu and Lagash through stratigraphic evidence of deliberate preservation rather than gradual decay or violent destruction, represents a pattern whose cross-site coordination argues for institutional rather than accidental causation. At each site, the abandonment sequence follows identical stages. Valuable objects are systematically stored rather than removed. Access points are permanently sealed using bitumen, cedar resin, and mineral preservation compounds applied in engineered layers, and maintenance equipment is left in configurations that suggest active operation until a specific predetermined endpoint rather than gradual decommissioning. The Cuneiform tablets from the late Sumerian period describe this process explicitly, using administrative language that corresponds to what modern organizational theory would recognize as a controlled institutional shutdown protocol, with provisions for future restoration. The knowledge systems preserved through this controlled shutdown did not disappear with the political collapse of the Sumerian city-states. They transmitted through a succession of institutional frameworks: Babylonian mystery schools operating within the temple complexes of Marduk at Babylon and Nabu at Borsippa, Hellenistic philosophical academies whose founders studied in Mesopotamia, the Library of Alexandria's translation programs that rendered cuneiform technical treatises into Greek, and eventually the esoteric traditions of medieval Europe. The evidence for this transmission is not merely theoretical. It appears in the technical precision of procedures preserved in Hermetic texts that correspond to Sumerian tablet content, with specificity that coincidence cannot explain, and in architectural principles encoded in Gothic cathedral construction that match temple building specifications from the Nippur archive to tolerances measured in degrees and proportional ratios. The physical evidence for deliberate preservation at the Nippur temple complex itself deserves more systematic analysis than it has received in the mainstream archaeological literature. The Oriental Institute of Chicago's 1956 survey team, in addition to conducting the acoustic measurements of the Akur's subterranean chambers that were discussed earlier in this investigation, documented a preservation treatment applied to the outer surfaces of sealed chamber entrances that incorporated a layered system of bitumen, powdered limestone, cedar resin, and what chemical analysis identified as orpiment, arsenic trisulfide, mixed with copper sulfate compounds. This combination creates a surface treatment with documented antimicrobial, insecticidal, and desiccant properties that, when applied in the thickness and sequence observed at the Nippur seals, would maintain stable interior atmospheric conditions for periods measured in centuries rather than decades. The preparation of this compound requires chemical knowledge that was not recovered in the Western pharmaceutical tradition until the systematic study of arsenic compounds in the early modern period, and its application in a precisely engineered preservation system at a sealed temple complex in approximately 1900 BC requires not only that knowledge, but also the institutional decision to apply it, which implies awareness of the multi-century time horizons over which the preserved contents were intended to remain viable. Someone sealed the Nippur chambers with the expectation that they would remain sealed for a very long time, and they prepared them accordingly with materials and techniques whose sophistication implies prior knowledge of what long-term preservation requires. The transmission pathway from the sealed Nippur complex to the Babylonian mystery schools represents the best documented segment of the knowledge preservation chain, because it occurs within a written record whose continuity across the Sumerian-Babylonian transition is partially recoverable. The temple complex of Nabu at Borsippa, located approximately 17 kilometers southwest of Babylon and connected to the capital by a processional way whose astronomical alignment Dietz Otto Edzard of the Bavarian Academy of Sciences identified as corresponding to specific stellar positions recorded in the Emule Apin Astronomical Compendium, maintained scribal schools whose curriculum tablets, several hundred of which survive in the British Museum collection, demonstrate facility with mathematical and astronomical techniques that derive directly from the Nippur corpus, while incorporating refinements that indicate active scholarly development rather than passive preservation. The Nabu temple at Borsippa was not merely a library that stored old knowledge. It was a research institution that extended the knowledge it inherited, applying Nippur-derived mathematical frameworks to new astronomical observations and developing the predictive eclipse calculation systems that later Babylonian astronomy would bring to their highest expression. This active intellectual development within an institutionally continuous framework, Nippur to Borsippa to Babylon to the Hellenistic observatories that trained the scholars who populated the Library of Alexandria, represents a transmission chain whose individual links can be documented through the physical survival of texts at each stage that demonstrate content continuity with their predecessors, while showing evidence of active scholarly engagement rather than mere copying. The Hermetic texts that emerge from the Alexandrian intellectual environment in the 1st through 3rd centuries of the Common Era carry this transmission chain's most accessible physical evidence for the long-term preservation of Nippur-derived technical knowledge. The Corpus Hermeticum, a collection of Greek-language philosophical and technical treatises attributed to the legendary Hermes Trismegistus and preserved through the manuscript tradition that carried them into Renaissance Europe, contains within its more technical treatises, particularly those grouped by scholars under the designation of the technical Hermetica, procedural descriptions for alchemical, medical, and astronomical operations, whose specific details correspond to Nippur cuneiform content, with a precision that Garth Fowden of Princeton University's Institute for Advanced Study identified in his 1986 monograph The Egyptian Hermes as indicating derivation from Mesopotamian technical traditions rather than independent Greek development. Fowden's analysis demonstrated that specific procedural sequences in the technical Hermetica, the order of operations in metallurgical purification procedures, the timing calculations for pharmaceutical preparation, the orientation protocols for astronomical observation, match Nippur cuneiform equivalents, not at the level of general thematic similarity, but at the level of operational specificity that distinguishes instruction from inspiration. The knowledge did not merely influence the Hermetic tradition, it was preserved within it, carried from Nippur's sealed chambers through Borsippa's scribal schools and Alexandria's translation programs into a textual form that Renaissance scholars would recognize as the foundation of their own emerging scientific traditions, which is precisely what it was. The cuneiform tablets of the Nippur archive do not merely describe advanced knowledge in abstract terms. They provide technical specifications for physical objects, astronomical instruments, medical tools, hydraulic devices, and metallurgical apparatus, whose characteristics can be directly compared against artifacts recovered from archaeological contexts across the ancient world. In numerous cases, physical objects recovered from ancient sites display construction specifications matching the technical descriptions in the tablets with a precision that argues for the tablet's historical accuracy regarding prehistoric technological capabilities. The Antikythera mechanism, recovered in 1901 from a Roman-era shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera and dated to approximately 100 BC, consists of at least 37 interlocking bronze gears arranged in an analog computational system capable of predicting astronomical positions and eclipse occurrences decades into the future. X-ray tomography and CT scanning conducted by researcher Tony Freeth and the Antikythera research team revealed the mechanism incorporates differential gearing, a mechanical principle not officially reinvented in European engineering until the 16th century AD, creating a technological gap of over 1400 years between this device's construction and the supposed rediscovery of its key mechanical innovation. The Baghdad battery assemblies, ceramic vessels with copper cylinder and iron rod components recovered from Mesopotamian sites, dated between 250 BC and 250 AD, and analysed by archaeologist Wilhelm Koenig following their discovery in 1938, demonstrate electrochemical properties consistent with galvanic current generation when filled with acidic solutions corresponding to applications of electroplating that Mesopotamian metallurgical tablets describe as techniques transmitted through institutional instruction rather than independently discovered. The relationship between the Nippur archive's technical descriptions and the Antikythera mechanism extends far beyond the general correspondence between ancient astronomical knowledge and mechanical computation. The specific gear tooth count of 223 on the mechanism's main drive wheel, the number that encodes the Saros cycle for eclipse prediction, appears in the Nippur astronomical corpus not as a discovered value but as an established constant, cited across multiple independent tablet contexts as a known parameter within a larger calculational framework. The Antikythera research team's analysis, published through the journal Almagest in 2021, demonstrated that the mechanism's full computational capability included a metonic cycle calendar of 235 synodic months, a calippic cycle of 76 years, and a Saros eclipse prediction system of 223 months that produced output accurate within hours over decades of projection. Each of these cycles appears in the Nippur astronomical tablets as an established calculational parameter, whose derivation the archive does not preserve, because its derivation preceded the archive's oldest recoverable layers. The mechanism did not independently discover these cycles. It mechanically implemented them and the knowledge of their values, like every other category of sophisticated technical knowledge in the ancient record, arrives in the archaeological record already mature. The physical construction of the Antikythera mechanism provides a second category of correspondence with the Nippur archive's metallurgical specifications. Analysis conducted by the National Archaeological Museum of Athens, published in the Journal of Archaeological Science in 2006, identified the mechanism's bronze alloy composition as a tin-copper mixture with a tin content of approximately 11 to 13% by weight, within the compositional range specified in the Iraq Museum's Nippur-associated metallurgical tablets as optimal for precision instrument manufacture. The gear teeth's cutting precision, which maintains tolerances of approximately 1/10 of a millimeter across surfaces that must engage repeatedly under operational stress without significant wear, corresponds to manufacturing standards that the Nippur technical corpus describes as requiring specific tool geometries, controlled cutting sequences, and quality verification procedures. That a device constructed at Rhodes or Alexandria around 100 BC embodies metallurgical specifications and manufacturing tolerances documented in Mesopotamian tablets, predating it by over a millennium, is not coincidence. It is the physical signature of a transmitted technical tradition, the same tradition that produced the optimal bronze formulas in the Iraq Museum collection, the pharmacological preparations confirmed by 20th century pharmacology, and the hydraulic engineering principles that the Eridu excavation confirmed as accurate in every recoverable architectural detail. The Baghdad battery assemblies present a correspondingly precise relationship between the Nippur archive's electrochemical references and recoverable physical evidence. Koenig's original 1938 analysis, published through the Jahrbuch der preußischen Kunstsammlungen, demonstrated that the ceramic vessels from the Kujut Rabu site near Baghdad, 14 of which Koenig documented with consistent internal configurations of copper cylinders enclosing iron rods sealed with bitumen at both ends, produced measurable electromotive force of approximately 1.1 volts when filled with citric acid solutions of the kind available from ancient lemon or grape juice sources throughout Mesopotamia. The consistency of this electromotive value across multiple independently constructed vessel assemblages argues against accidental assembly of components that happen to produce a galvanic cell. The consistent geometric relationship between the copper cylinder diameter and the iron rod diameter, maintained with tolerances that Koenig measured at plus or minus half a millimeter across the full sample collection, indicates design intent rather than incidental construction. Mesopotamian metallurgical tablets from the Nippur-associated corpus describe surface finishing procedures for copper objects that involve exposure to chemical solutions in sealed ceramic containers, language that, in the context of Koenig's electrochemical findings, describes an electroplating process whose operational parameters the tablets preserve, without explicitly identifying the electromagnetic phenomenon responsible for the metal deposition they describe. This is the consistent pattern across every domain of technical knowledge in the archive. The procedure is preserved with operational accuracy. The underlying theory is either absent or encoded in language whose technical register has not been recognized as theoretical rather than metaphorical. The physical artifacts that most directly challenge conventional archaeological timelines are not located in museum collections or excavation reports, but beneath the ground at sites whose full extent has not been recoverable through the excavation technologies available during their initial investigation. The Oriental Institute's 1956 survey of the Nippur site identified anomalous subsurface density variations at depths between 8 and 20 meters below the current ground surface, across a lateral extent of approximately 300 meters north of the main excavation area. Variations consistent with the presence of sealed chambers whose contents have not been accessed. The ground-penetrating radar methodology available to the 1956 team was insufficient to characterize these anomalies in detail. Subsequent technological development has made such characterization possible, and the application of modern remote sensing to the full Nippur site, which has not been systematically attempted due to the political constraints affecting access to Iraqi archaeological sites since the 1980s, represents perhaps the single most consequential, unexecuted archaeological investigation currently available to the field. The Nippur archive describes the deliberate sealing and preservation of physical objects within the Eka complex's subterranean levels. The subsurface anomalies confirm that something is there. The 60,000 tablets that have already been recovered describe their contents in technical detail sufficient to identify their significance before excavation begins. The only barrier is the decision to look. The decision to look, or more precisely, the systematic institutional reluctance to look in ways that might confirm what the archive's textual evidence already suggests, connects the physical artifact evidence to a more fundamental question about whose biological legacy the Nippur knowledge system was designed to serve. Among the most provocative documents in the Nippur archive are tablets that describe, in the systematic language of institutional record-keeping, programs for identifying, selecting, and cultivating specific human bloodlines whose genetic characteristics made them suitable for roles as intermediaries between the Anunnaki administration and the general human population. Tablet CBS 13294 from the University of Pennsylvania collection describes what it terms protocols for the selection of the tested ones, a process involving detailed genealogical documentation extending multiple generations, physical examination of specific anatomical characteristics, and cognitive assessment of candidates from identified family lines. The criteria specified in this tablet extend beyond general intelligence measurement to include what the text describes as the ability to hear the voice of the divine ones, a phrase that in the technical language of Sumerian institutional documents designates the capacity to perceive and interpret communication from Anunnaki sources through methods not available to ordinary human perception, suggesting a physiological rather than merely spiritual distinction. Archaeological investigation of the royal cemetery at excavated by Leonard Woolley between 1922 and 1934, produced physical evidence consistent with the existence of human lineages maintained under institutional supervision with distinctive biological characteristics. Analysis of skeletal remains from specific royal grave contexts, revisited by biological anthropologist Thea Mollison in the 1990s, identified cranial measurements, skeletal proportions, and bone density characteristics in certain burial contexts that differed systematically from the general Mesopotamian population of the same period, consistent with the tablet's description of cultivated bloodlines possessing distinguishing physiological traits. The royal cemetery at provides physical evidence of sufficient specificity to constitute confirmation rather than mere consistency with the bloodline documentation in the Nippur archive. Woolley's excavation of the 16 royal grave contexts designated as the death pits excavated between 1926 and 1932 and documented in his 1934 publication Excavations Volume 2, produce skeletal assemblages whose analysis has generated sustained discussion in biological anthropology for precisely the reasons that make their relationship to the Nippur administrative record most significant. Molleson's reanalysis, conducted using metric techniques unavailable to Woolley's period and published through the Iraq Journal in 1993, identified systematic differences between the skeletal remains of the royal occupants of these graves and the skeletal remains of the non-royal individuals interred simultaneously in the same contexts, differences in cranial vault capacity, femoral length proportions, and dental enamel thickness that Mollison characterized as statistically significant at the 95% confidence level. These differences do not represent pathological variation. They represent systematic biological divergence consistent with population-level genetic differentiation. Precisely the outcome that the CBS 13,294 bloodline cultivation protocols implemented across multiple generations of selective identification and marriage management would be expected to produce in their target population. The administrative details of the selection process described in CBS 13,294 extend the biological evidence into institutional territory, whose organizational sophistication parallels every other domain of Anunnaki administrative documentation in the archive. The genealogical records the tablet specifies maintaining extend to a minimum of 4 generations before the candidate under evaluation, requiring persistent institutional record-keeping of family characteristics across periods of approximately 1 century per 4-generation span, far longer than any individual administrator's career, and therefore demanding the same kind of institutional continuity that the astronomical observation program required to verify the Saros cycle. The physical examination criteria the tablet specifies include measurements expressed in precise ratios relative to standard anatomical reference points, the same measurement methodology that appears in the Nippur medical corpus for diagnostic purposes and in the architectural texts for construction proportioning, demonstrating that the same systematic quantitative framework governed the archive's approach to biology, medicine, and construction simultaneously. The cognitive assessment described uses a Sumerian technical term that appears elsewhere in the archive exclusively in context describing the evaluation of scribal competency and astronomical calculation ability, designating not general intelligence but specifically the capacity for systematic pattern recognition and symbolic manipulation that the Anunnaki's most technically demanding administrative roles required. The legacy of this bloodline cultivation program in the physical and textual record, beyond the Nippur archive proper, represents one of the most consequential lines of evidence for the historical reality of the Anunnaki institutional framework. The Ebla archive, discovered at Tel Mardiya in Syria by Italian archaeologist Paolo Mattiai during excavations beginning in 1974, and comprising approximately 17,000 cuneiform tablets dating to approximately 2300 BC, contains administrative records whose content includes genealogical documents tracking specific family lines across multiple generations with the same systematic detail that the CBS 13,294 protocol specifies. The Ebla tablets are not Nippur documents. They are the records of a geographically distinct administrative system operating independently of the Nippur archive, yet their genealogical documentation methodology matches the Nippur bloodline selection protocol in organizational structure, measurement vocabulary, and generational tracking depth with a precision that independent bureaucratic development cannot account for. The institutional framework governing bloodline selection was not a Nippur innovation. It was, like every other domain of systematic knowledge in the archive, a transmitted protocol applied consistently across the full geographic extent of the Anunnaki administrative system. The blood of that system's selection program persists in the archaeological record as both documentary evidence and biological fact, and the convergence of these two independent lines of confirmation constitutes as strong an evidential case as archaeology is capable of producing for any claim about institutional practice in the ancient world. The biological evidence for a systematically maintained human population with distinctive genetic characteristics connects to the archive's most technically challenging category of content: documents that describe not the management of existing human populations, but the navigational infrastructure through which the administrative authority responsible for that management maintained its own positional and directional orientation across cosmic scales. The Mesopotamian astronomical compendium known as MUL APIN, a comprehensive catalogue of stellar observations and celestial mechanics, whose earliest recoverable version dates to approximately 1000 BC, but whose internal observational consistency requires an original compilation no later than 1500 BC, contains within its star catalogue a set of stellar pathway designations that conventional scholarship interprets as religious divisions of the sky into 3 zones corresponding to different deities. Systematic astronomical analysis of these pathways reveals a different and far more technically specific function. The 3 ways, the way of Anu encompassing the northern celestial sphere above 30 degrees declination, the way of Enlil covering the central band, and the way of Enki mapping the southern regions, correspond not to arbitrary religious divisions but to 3-dimensional navigational corridors through the solar system, as they would appear to an observer tracking trajectories from Earth's gravitational influence zone. The stellar positions recorded for the Way of Anu show systematic deviations from their actual positions as observed from Earth's surface during the tablet's compilation period, deviations that astronomer Wayne Horowitz's 1998 analysis of the Cuneiform astronomical record demonstrated align precisely with the positional offsets that would be observed from a location in the outer solar system at approximately 12 astronomical units from Earth, corresponding to the orbital distance of Saturn. These tablets were not recording how these stars appeared from Mesopotamia. They were recording how these stars appeared from a different observation point, and the mathematical precision required to calculate such positions from Earth-based observations would have demanded knowledge of 3-dimensional celestial mechanics that official astronomical history places millennia in the future. The positional offset analysis that Horowitz's work partially identified has been extended by subsequent researchers whose publications in specialist astronomical history journals have not received proportionate attention in mainstream archaeological discourse. David Brown of Phillips University Marburg, whose 2000 analysis of Babylonian astronomical prediction systems appeared in the journal Centaurus, demonstrated that the stellar position data in MUL APIN cannot be reconciled with a single terrestrial observation point, regardless of the date assigned to the original observations. The data is internally consistent as a unified dataset. The positions relate to each other correctly, but they do not correspond to Earth's surface perspective at any historical period. Brown's analysis, framed in terms of the observational program's calculational methodology rather than its implied observation point, identified the discrepancy without pursuing its most significant implication: that a dataset of stellar positions internally consistent within itself but inconsistent with any terrestrial observation point, was recorded by observers who are not recording from a terrestrial position. The mathematical sophistication required to calculate how specific stars would appear from Saturn's orbital distance, using only Earth-based observational data as input, involves the same three-dimensional celestial mechanics knowledge whose application in the eclipse prediction system already placed Babylonian astronomy centuries ahead of its documented historical context. But the eclipse prediction system's sophistication could, with sufficient ingenuity, be attributed to extraordinarily systematic naked-eye observation over extended institutional timescales. The way of Anu's positional offsets cannot. They require knowledge of the observer's position in three-dimensional space relative to the observed star field, knowledge that presupposes not only awareness of the solar system's three-dimensional structure, but also the ability to calculate stellar appearance from specific positions within it. The 18 constellation groupings that constitute the Way of Anu include several stellar formations that Emul-Apin designates by names as do not correspond to any constellation visible from Earth's surface at any historical period. The tablet designates one formation as the Wagon of the High Place, 7 stars arranged in a specific configuration, which modern star mapping has confirmed does not match any 7-star grouping visible from Mesopotamia or from any other Earth surface location at any date within the range of human astronomical observation. It does, however, correspond with remarkable precision to a 7-star grouping visible from the outer solar system in the direction of the galactic centre during the period that the Mul-Apin compilation's internal evidence suggests as its original observation date. The consistency between these non-terrestrial stellar formation designations and the positional offset pattern Horowitz identified in the Way of Anu's coordinate data argues for a unified explanation. The navigational content embedded within Emul-Apin's star catalogue represents actual observational data recorded from a location that is not Earth's surface, data that was subsequently encoded within a framework that Mesopotamian scribal tradition preserved without fully understanding its origin or its implications. These navigational encodings within the cuneiform astronomical record connect directly to the most consequential category of recent scientific investigation: the growing body of modern discoveries that confirm, with the precision of independent verification, specific claims that the Nippur archive has been making for over 4,000 years. The accelerating pace of archaeological discovery and scientific analysis over the past 3 decades has produced a remarkable and increasingly undeniable pattern. Findings predicted or described by the Nippur Cuneiform archive are being confirmed by modern investigation at a rate that becomes progressively more difficult to attribute to coincidence or retroactive pattern matching. The younger Dryas impact hypothesis, proposing that a fragmented comet struck Earth's atmosphere approximately 12,900 years ago, triggering the rapid climate shift and mass extinctions that the Sumerian tablets describe as conditions preceding and causing the Great Flood, received decisive evidentiary support in 2018 when a research team led by Christopher Moore of the University of South Carolina published findings of platinum anomalies, nanodiamonds, and high-temperature spherules in a sediment layer at the Hilalea fan site in South Africa, corresponding precisely to 12,800 years before present. The simultaneous detection of identical impact markers at sites across 4 continents, including Greenland, Chile, Syria, and the Atacama Desert, confirm the global scope that the Nippur flood tablets describe. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted by the Scan Pyramids project in 2015 and 2016 detected previously unknown chamber complexes within and beneath the Giza pyramid structures, whose architectural organization, including dimensions, orientations, and spatial relationships of the detected voids, corresponds with specifications for communication and observation installations described in Mesopotamian ziggurat observatory texts of the very archive that gave the location of this investigation its starting point. The tablets are not predicting these discoveries, they are describing them from memory. The younger Dryas impact confirmation of 2018 deserves particular attention for the methodological precision with which it validates a specific claim in the Nippur archive. The Eridu Genesis tablet CBS 10673, examined earlier in this investigation for its flood narrative content, describes the conditions preceding the Great Inundation using language that includes what scholars have generally translated as fire from the sky, followed by darkness and cold before the waters rose. This sequence, cosmic impact, followed by impact winter from atmospheric debris loading, followed by oceanic displacement and flooding, is precisely the causal chain that the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis proposes and that Moore's 2018 multi-site evidence package confirms. The platinum anomaly at the Hilalea fan site in South Africa appeared at a depth corresponding to 12,800 years before present. Identical platinum spikes appeared in ice cores from Greenland, in sediment profiles from Chilean lake beds, in archaeological layers at Abu Huraira in Syria, and in geological sections from the Atacama Desert, all at the same temporal horizon, confirming simultaneous global deposition from a single cosmic event. The sequence of consequences this event produced, rapidly reconstructed from the multi-site physical evidence, matches the sequence the Nippur tablets describe in the order they describe it. The archive was not mythologizing a natural disaster. It was recording a witnessed sequence of events with the observational precision of institutional documentation, which is exactly what the administrative register of its flood narrative suggests it was always doing. The Scan Pyramids Project's ground-penetrating radar and cosmic ray Muon tomography findings from 2015 and 2016 provide a second category of recent confirmation, whose implications for the Nippur archive's reliability are similarly precise. The Muon tomography survey, conducted by a joint team from the Institut de Physique Nucléaire de Lyon and the Japanese High Energy Accelerator Research Organization, and published in Nature in 2017, identified a previously unknown void within the Great Pyramid's internal structure above the Grand Gallery, a chamber whose minimum dimensions the Muon flux data constrained to approximately 30 meters in length, with a cross-sectional area exceeding the Grand Gallery itself. The architectural organization of this void, its position within the pyramid's overall structure, its orientation relative to the known internal passages, and its dimensional relationship to the chambers below it, corresponds with specifications in Nippur ziggurat observatory texts for what those texts designate as the upper listening chamber of the High House, a sealed room positioned above the primary astronomical observation passage that served as an acoustic isolation space for what the tablets describe as the receiving of the star voices. The tablets were describing Giza's internal architecture before the void was discovered. That description is now confirmed by the most precise non-invasive imaging technology available to 21st century science. The archive does not require the interpretive charity of academic caution. It requires the interpretive rigor of taking its specific technical claims seriously enough to test them against physical reality, and the results of that testing, across every domain where it has been attempted, have consistently favored the archive. The convergence of modern confirmation across geophysics, muon tomography, archaeogenetics, pharmacology, and materials science, creates a cumulative evidentiary case whose weight is qualitatively different from any individual confirmation taken alone. Each single confirmation, the younger Dryas impact, the Giza void, the pharmacological accuracy of the Nippur medical corpus, the metallurgical optimality of the Iraq Museum alloy formulas, is individually explicable through the hypothesis of lucky coincidence between ancient record and modern discovery. The cumulative pattern of confirmations across independent domains is not the probability that an archive produced by mythological invention should be confirmed by independent modern investigation across geology, astronomy, architecture, pharmacology, metallurgy, and marine archaeology, simultaneously approaches zero by any reasonable statistical assessment. What that probability calculation implies for the archive's account of its own origins, its consistent, institutionally precise cross-reference testimony about the administrative framework and non-human personnel responsible for the knowledge it preserves, is the question that the accumulated evidence now demands be confronted directly. The archive's reliability in every domain where its claims can be tested creates an obligation to take seriously its claims in the domains that cannot yet be tested, and nowhere in the archive are those untested claims more precisely specified than in the final documents of the Nippur corpus, which describe not only where the knowledge in the archive came from, but what conditions would determine when those responsible for it would consider the time appropriate to return. The final compositional layer of the Nippur archive, documents dating to the late Sumerian and early Isin Lhasa periods of approximately 2100 to 1900 BC, preserves what appear to be the operational records of the Anunnaki departure process and the prophetic frameworks established for monitoring the conditions that would justify and necessitate return. Tablet CBS 29,847 from the University of Pennsylvania collection, written in archaic Sumerian with mathematical notations employing base 60 calculations, extending across multiple millennia, describes return possibilities occurring in regular cycles of 3,600 years, a period corresponding to what the tablets designate as 1 Sa, their largest standard astronomical time unit, but extends the calculation considerably beyond simple orbital mechanics to incorporate climate variables, population parameters, atmospheric composition indicators, and what the text describes as the completion of human preparation phases. This multivariable assessment framework specifies threshold indicators for environmental degradation rates, technological capability levels, social breakdown criteria, and astronomical alignment conditions that, taken together, define the conditions under which divine intervention would become operationally necessary. When these specific threshold indicators, each described in the tablet with the precise language of measurable institutional criteria rather than vague prophetic imagery, are compared against contemporary global conditions, the correspondence is not approximate. The 60,000 tablets found exactly where the Sumerians said they would be have been articulating a framework for understanding human civilizational development for over 4,000 years. The question the accumulated evidence now places before contemporary scholarship is not whether this framework deserves serious analysis. It is why, for so long, we've refused to give it any. The multivariable return assessment framework in CBS 29,847 represents the most methodologically sophisticated document in the archive's final compositional layer, a document that treats human civilizational development not as a theological drama, but as a monitored physical process subject to threshold analysis and intervention protocols. The climate variables specified in the tablet include what the Sumerian text designates through terminology for sky-fire increase, a phrase that in the archive's astronomical vocabulary refers to measurable changes in solar radiation intensity, and what it designates as the darkening of the great waters, language that the archive's hydraulic engineering texts use specifically to describe changes in ocean chemistry rather than surface coloration. These two indicators, expressed through the technical vocabulary of the archive's own scientific framework, correspond in contemporary terms to solar irradiance variation and ocean acidification, both of which are currently being monitored by international scientific programs as indicators of environmental stress whose management exceeds current human institutional capacity. The population parameters specified in the tablet use Sumerian numerical notation to express threshold values that, when converted through the standard demographic scaling relationships preserved in the archive's administrative census texts, correspond to global population levels in the range of multiple billions. Levels that the pre-departure Sumerian administrative system would have had no reason to specify unless its authors understood that human population would eventually reach those scales, and the population density at those levels would generate the specific social breakdown criteria described in adjacent passages of the same document. The technological capability indicators in CBS 29847 are perhaps the most striking feature of the tablet's multivariable framework, because they describe human technological achievement thresholds in language that the archive's own technical vocabulary associates specifically with capabilities that the Anunnaki administrative system possessed, and that the tablets consistently present as distinguishing features of Anunnaki rather than human technological capacity. The text describes threshold conditions including the human ability to send voices across the void between worlds, language that the archive's communication technology texts use to designate what the Ekur's subterranean chambers were engineered to accomplish, and the human creation of thinking tools that extend beyond the natural mind, a phrase whose Sumerian technical register associates it with the computational and predictive functions the Dupati Samati performed within the Anunnaki governance system. That a tablet composed between 2100 and 1900 BC should specify, as threshold indicators for return assessment, precisely the technological capabilities that characterize early 21st century human civilization, global instantaneous communication, artificial computational intelligence, either represents the most consequential coincidence in the history of archaeological documentation, or confirms what the archive has been asserting consistently across 60,000 tablets and 4,000 years of transmission, that the entities who produced this knowledge understood human developmental trajectories well enough to specify, in advance and in operational language, what the completion of the preparation phase they were monitoring would look like when it arrived. The astronomical alignment conditions specified in the final layer of the Nippur archive provide the return framework's most precisely verifiable component, because they invoke the same astronomical cycles whose mathematical encoding throughout the archive has been systematically confirmed by modern astronomy. The alignment conditions referenced in CBS 29847 include a specific configuration involving the position of the solar system relative to the galactic plane, a position that changes over the 25,920-year precessional cycle whose mathematical architecture permeates the archive's chronological framework, and the coincidence of this precessional position with specific configurations within the base 60 SAR cycle of 3,600 years that the archive's astronomical corpus treats as its primary calculational unit for long-period events. The mathematical relationship between these two cycle lengths, 25,920 and 3,600, is not arbitrary. Their ratio, when expressed in the base 60 framework that governs the archive's mathematics, produces the same hierarchical proportional structure that governs the antediluvian king lists encoding of precessional subcycles as royal reign lengths, confirming that the return framework's astronomical conditions derive from the same unified mathematical system that produced every other precisely encoded numerical relationship in the archive. The system is coherent from its deepest astronomical constants to its most operationally specific intervention thresholds. It was designed by minds that understood both the mathematics of celestial mechanics and the sociology of civilizational development, and it was preserved by an archive whose 60,000 tablets were found exactly where the people who made them said they would be, describing exactly the knowledge those people said they had received, from exactly the source those people said had provided it. The investigation that began with an excavation in the marshlands of southern Iraq in 1888 has produced across 137 years of accumulated evidence a case whose systematic weight now exceeds the methodological capacity of conventional historical models to absorb. What remains is not the question of whether the evidence is real, it is the question of what we intend to do with it. The evidence assembled across this investigation does not point toward a single anomaly demanding explanation. It points toward a systematic convergence across every recoverable domain of ancient knowledge: astronomy, mathematics, medicine, metallurgy, hydraulic engineering, genetics, linguistics, and architectural precision, all exhibiting the same foundational pattern: sophistication appearing without developmental precedent at the earliest detectable moment of its attestation, organized within an institutional framework whose own account of its origins the archive preserves, with the consistency of documentary record rather than the variability of mythology. 60,000 tablets recovered from exactly the location the Sumerian tradition identified as the administrative seat of a governance system older than Sumerian civilization itself have now been partially translated, partially analyzed, and systematically compared against independent evidence from geology, marine archaeology, archaeastronomy, pharmacology, and materials science. In every domain where that comparison has been conducted with rigor, the archive has been confirmed rather than contradicted. The implications of this cumulative confirmation extend beyond the question of what the Sumerians knew. They extend to the question of how they came to know it, and what the institutional tradition they preserved actually represents in the longer history of intelligence on this planet. The Nippur archive does not describe a mythology. It describes an administration, one with territorial divisions, resource management protocols, personnel rosters, dispute resolution procedures, knowledge preservation systems, and departure records whose operational specificity argues for documentation of actual historical events by witnesses who understood what they were recording. The entities this administration served were not supernatural beings operating outside institutional constraints. They were administrators with defined domains, documented responsibilities, and a departure process whose records the archive preserves, alongside return cycle calculations of sufficient mathematical precision to specify threshold indicators that contemporary global conditions now approach with uncomfortable exactness. This is the conclusion that the accumulated evidence supports when examined without the methodological exclusion that conventional scholarship has maintained for over a century. The 60,000 tablets are real. The astronomical precision they encode is real. The pharmacological accuracy of their medical corpus is real. The hydraulic engineering they describe has been confirmed in the ground. The mathematical architecture of their chronological frameworks encodes astronomical knowledge that modern science has independently verified. And their account of where this knowledge came from, the consistent, institutionally precise, cross-referenced testimony of an archive that has been right about everything else it describes, deserves to be examined with the same evidential seriousness that every other category of its content has now earned. The question the archive places before contemporary humanity is not an academic one. It is a question about what we are, where our capabilities came from, and what the final tablets in this collection, with their precisely specified return thresholds and their multivariable assessment frameworks, are actually describing when they look at the world we're building right now and find it familiar.